Hello everyone. I am the storyteller and I am here to help you today. I know you use this video to fall asleep, so before that, like the video and subscribe to the channel. Also, where are you from and what time are you watching? Now get comfortable and relax. Part 1, The Unsettling Inheritance. Chapter 1, After the Funeral. The scent of lilies, cloyingly sweet and funereal, still clung to Alastair Finch's suit jacket. He'd hung it in the spare room wardrobe of the small, furnished cottage he'd rented, sight unseen, in a place called Oakhaven, but the smell persisted, a ghostly miasma of the worst day of his life. It had been 3 weeks since Sarah's funeral, a month since the call that had cleaved his world in two. Alastair, an urban planner by trade, a man who believed in order, in the predictable flow of infrastructure and human design, found himself adrift in a sea of incomprehensible chaos. Sarah, his Sarah, vibrant and alive, maker of lists and lover of winding country roads, was gone. A freak accident, they'd called it. A lorry shedding its load on a blind bend of the A317, a road she drove twice a week to visit her mother. No fault of hers. Cold comfort. The London flat, once a carefully curated space of shared dreams and comfortable routines, had become a mausoleum. Every object, every scent, every shadow, whispered her name. He couldn't breathe there, couldn't think. His meticulously planned life, their meticulously planned future, had been bulldozed. His job, designing the expansion of a new satellite town, felt like a cruel joke. How could he plan futures when his own had been so brutally erased? His bereavement leave was a gaping void. His well-meaning colleagues called, their voices hushed with platitudes he couldn't bear. So he'd run. He'd scoured online listings for somewhere remote but not desolate, somewhere the silence wouldn't be entirely his own making. Oakhaven, a name that evoked sturdy trees and quiet havens, nestled on the Essex coast, had seemed as good a place as any to disappear. The house was called Thorncroft. The estate agent, a cheerful woman named Mrs. Albright whose optimism felt like sandpaper on Alastair's raw nerves, had been up front. It's characterful, Mr. Finch. Been empty a little while. The previous owner, a Mr. Elias Thorne, was a bit of a recluse. Died here, natural causes, but, well, he kept to himself. Characterful was one word for it. Perched on a slight rise overlooking the grey, shingled beach and the even greyer North Sea, Thorncroft was a 2-story Victorian house, built of dark, weathered stone that seemed to absorb the light. Its gables were sharp, its windows narrow, like suspicious eyes. A tangled garden, choked with brambles and sea-blasted shrubs, surrounded it. It wasn't overtly menacing, just sullen. Resigned. It suited Alastair's mood. He'd bought it outright, a reckless, impulsive decision fueled by grief and the urgent need for a place where Sarah's ghost might not immediately find him. The price had been surprisingly low, almost as if Oakhaven itself was eager to pass on the burden of Thorncroft. The drive from London had been a blur of motorways and A-roads, each mile a further step away from the life he knew. Oakhaven, when he finally reached it, was a quiet town, its main street boasting a pub, a general store, a fish and chip shop, and little else. The off-season quiet lay thick, the cries of gulls the loudest sound. Mrs. Albright met him at the gate, keys jangling. All yours, Mr. Finch. Electrics are on, water's running. Bit dusty, I expect. Mr. Thorne wasn't much for housekeeping in his later years. She gave him a pitying look that he loathed. Anything you need, the village is very friendly. Though, you might want to get some logs in for the fire before winter truly bites. She left him standing before the heavy oak front door, the cold sea breeze tugging at his coat. He fumbled with the old iron key, the lock stiff and unwilling. Finally, with a reluctant groan, it turned. The air that greeted him from within was cold, still, and carried the distinct, layered scent of old paper, dust, and something else, something faintly metallic, like old ink or cold iron. He stepped inside. The house was larger than it looked, a warren of small, shadowed rooms. Most of the furniture was shrouded in white dust sheets, looking like a congregation of pale, slumped figures. It was the study, however, that arrested his attention. Mrs. Albright had mentioned it. Mr. Thorne was a surveyor, you see. Left all his bits and bobs. Said in the will they were to stay with the house. Part of its charm, I suppose. The study was at the back of the house, overlooking the bleak expanse of the sea. Unlike the other rooms, it was not shrouded. It was full. Bookshelves overflowed with leather-bound tomes and tightly rolled scrolls. A huge, scarred wooden table dominated the center of the room, its surface littered with arcane-looking brass instruments Alastair vaguely recognized as surveying equipment, a theodolite with its brass dulled by age, heavy measuring chains coiled like metallic snakes, compasses, and strange, spidery devices he couldn't name. And maps. Everywhere, there were maps. Stacked on shelves, rolled in tubes, pinned to the walls, even spread across the floor in untidy piles. Maps of the local coastline, maps of distant mountain ranges, star charts, geological surveys, hand-drawn sketches of astonishing detail. Alastair, the urban planner, felt a flicker of something other than grief. Professional curiosity, perhaps. Or maybe just the allure of someone else's obsession, a welcome distraction from his own suffocating sorrow. He ran a hand over a large, leather-bound atlas, the hide cool and smooth beneath his fingers. This was Elias Thorne's world. And now, inexplicably, it was his. He wondered, briefly, what kind of man dedicates his life so entirely to the delineation of space, to the capturing of landscapes on paper. What had Thorne been searching for, or perhaps, running from, in these meticulously drawn lines and shaded contours? He closed the study door, the scent of old paper and ink already seeping into his clothes. For now, he needed to unpack, to try and impose some semblance of his old order onto this new, strange place. But he knew, with a certainty that settled like a stone in his gut, that he would be back in that room. The maps, and the ghost of their creator, were waiting. Chapter 2, Unpacking Ghosts. The first few days in Oakhaven were a disorienting blend of practicalities and profound emptiness. Alastair unpacked the few boxes he'd brought, clothes, toiletries, a handful of books he couldn't bring himself to read, and a framed photograph of Sarah, laughing, her hair caught in the wind on a Brighton pier. He placed it on the bedside table in the master bedroom, a room that felt far too large and cold for one person. The house creaked and groaned around him, a symphony of unfamiliar sounds. The wind, a constant presence off the North Sea, whistled through ill-fitting window frames and rattled the sash cords. Floorboards sighed under his weight. At night, the silence between the wind's laments was absolute, a suffocating blanket that amplified the frantic thrumming of his own heart. He missed the dull, predictable roar of London traffic, the comforting noises of a city that never truly slept. He forced himself into a routine. Coffee, toast, a walk along the shingled beach where the gray waves clawed listlessly at the shore. He'd pick up supplies from the general store, exchanging brief, awkward pleasantries with the locals, who regarded him with a mixture of curiosity and polite reserve. They knew he was the newcomer, the city man who'd bought Thorncroft. He could feel their unspoken questions, their pity. His afternoons were increasingly drawn to Elias Thorne's study. It was the most compelling room in the house, a sealed capsule of another man's life. The dust lay thick on every surface except the central table, which seemed to have been recently used, though Mrs. Albright had said no one had been in since Thorne's body was removed. A faint indentation in the dust on the worn leather chair suggested someone had sat there, hunched over the maps, not long ago. Alastair, methodical by nature, began to sort through the chaos. He found logs Thorne had written, not journals. But records of surveys, coordinates, weather conditions, meticulous and dry. There were receipts for specialized paper, inks, and the upkeep of his brass instruments. Thorne had been active until very near the end, it seemed. The maps themselves were a vast, bewildering collection. Some were printed, official Ordnance Survey maps from various decades, annotated with Thorne's spidery handwriting. Others were clearly hand-drawn, works of incredible artistry and precision. Coastlines rendered with feathery strokes, contour lines weaving like intricate lacework, tiny, perfectly lettered place names, some of which Alastair couldn't find on any modern map. There were maps of places that seemed fantastical, islands that resembled no known landmass, intricate city plans for metropolises that surely never existed. As an urban planner, he could appreciate the technical skill, the dedication. Thorne had been a master cartographer. But there was something more to it, an intensity that bordered on mania. Why map imaginary cities? Why chart coastlines with such obsessive detail if they weren't real? He found Thorne's surveying equipment unsettlingly beautiful. The brass theodolite, despite its tarnish, gleamed dully in the weak afternoon light filtering through the grimy window. He touched its cold, metal barrel, imagined Thorne squinting through its eyepiece, capturing angles, measuring distances, translating the three-dimensional world into two-dimensional representation. There was a set of Gunter's chains, heavy and precise, and a collection of planimeters and parallel rulers, tools of a dying art in the age of GPS and GIS. Sometimes, in the study, Alastair felt a peculiar sensation, as if he wasn't entirely alone. A subtle drop in temperature, the feeling of eyes on his back. He'd turn, expecting to see someone, but there was only the dusty room, the silent maps, the window looking out onto the empty sea. He dismissed it as grief, stress, the solitude playing tricks on his mind. He avoided thinking too deeply about Sarah, about the accident. When her image surfaced, sharp and painful, he would focus on some intricate detail on a map, the careful shading of a mountain range, the elegant curve of a river. The maps were a refuge, a complex, ordered world he could lose himself in, unlike the jagged, senseless reality of his loss. One evening, as dusk painted the sky in bruised purples and grays, he was examining a detailed map of the Essex coastline, clearly one of Thorne's own creations. He noticed a small, almost invisible annotation near Oakhaven itself, a tiny, sketched symbol, like a spiral or a labyrinth. He traced it with his finger, a strange prickling sensation running up his arm. The house was quiet, save for the rhythmic sigh of the waves. He found himself listening intently, straining to hear something beyond the usual creaks and groans. He thought he heard it then, a faint sound from downstairs, like the rustle of stiff paper, or the scratch of a quill pen on parchment. He held his breath. The sound came again, subtle but distinct. From the direction of the study. Alastair rose slowly, his heart thumping. He moved to the door, eased it open, and peered down the shadowy hallway. Nothing. Silence. He crept down the stairs, each tread seeming to echo in the stillness. The study door was closed, as he'd left it. He pushed it open. The room was as he'd seen it last, maps spread out, instruments gleaming faintly. But the air felt different. Colder. And the scent of ink was stronger, fresher. He scanned the room, his gaze falling on the large map of the Essex coast he'd been studying earlier. The small spiral symbol he'd noticed seemed darker, the ink somehow more vibrant, as if freshly drawn. He shook his head. Impossible. It was his imagination, his tired eyes. Grief was a powerful hallucinogen. He backed out of the room, pulling the door shut, a little too quickly. That night, he left the photograph of Sarah face down on the bedside table. The ghosts in this house were enough to contend with, he didn't need to invite more. Chapter 3, The First Anomaly. Weeks bled into one another, marked by the ebb and flow of the tides and the slow, relentless progression of Alastair's grief. He'd cleared one of the smaller rooms upstairs and set up a makeshift office, intending to do some freelance consulting work, something to keep his mind tethered to the familiar world of planning and design. But his focus was fractured, his motivation non-existent. The pull of Thorne's study was too strong. He'd begun a more systematic cataloging of the maps, partly as a professional exercise, partly as a desperate attempt to impose order on Thorne's chaotic legacy, and by extension, his own unraveling thoughts. He bought archival sleeves and flat file drawers, transforming a corner of the study into a semblance of an archive. It was during this process, on a bleak Tuesday morning with rain lashing against the windows, that he found it. The map was of Surrey, specifically the area around Guildford, where he and Sarah had lived for 5 years before moving to London. It was an older Ordnance Survey sheet, well used, with faint pencil marks and calculations in the margins, Thorne's hand, undoubtedly. But Thorne was from Essex, had lived and died in Oakhaven. What interest would he have in this particular patch of Surrey? Alastair spread it out on the large table, his fingers tracing familiar routes. Their old flat was marked with a tiny, precise X. A wave of unexpected emotion hit him, a sharp pang of nostalgia mixed with the ever-present ache of loss. He remembered weekend drives with Sarah, exploring the Surrey hills, getting deliberately lost on winding country lanes. His eyes scanned the network of roads, his professional training kicking in. He noted the familiar spaghetti of the A3, the M25's orbital sprawl. And then he saw it. A secondary road, a B road designation he didn't recognize, snaking away from a junction on the A317. It was drawn with the same official print as the rest of the map, seemingly an integral part of the surveyed landscape. It led, with unnerving directness, towards a specific intersection, an intersection he knew with hideous, intimate clarity. The place where Sarah had died. A cold dread uncoiled in Alastair's stomach. He stared at the map, his breath catching in his throat. That road, it didn't exist. Not like that. He knew that stretch of the A317 intimately. He'd driven it himself countless times. After the accident, he'd replayed Sarah's final journey in his mind 1,000 times, poring over online maps, satellite images, trying to understand, to find some logic in the senselessness. The intersection where the lorry had shed its load was notorious for a blind bend just before it. There was no B road feeding into it from that direction. There had been talk, years ago, of a relief road, a bypass to alleviate congestion, but the plans had been shelved due to environmental concerns and funding cuts. Some preliminary groundwork might have been done, a few trees cleared, but nothing more. Yet, here it was on Thorne's map, depicted as a fully established, numbered road. Clear as day. His first thought was that this was an older map, predating some major redevelopment. But the A317 itself, and the surrounding major roads, were shown in their current configurations. And the M25, a relatively modern motorway, was also present. The map was from the late 1980s or early 1990s, judging by the legend style. The relief road project he vaguely remembered had been mooted around then, but it had never progressed beyond proposal stage. He pulled out his laptop, his hands trembling slightly. He brought up a current Ordnance Survey map of the area, then Google Maps, switching to satellite view. Nothing. Forest, fields, exactly as he remembered. He even searched for historical maps online, looking for any official record of this B road. There was no trace. It wasn't just an old, decommissioned road. It was a phantom road. A road that had never been, yet was clearly, unequivocally, printed on Elias Thorne's map. And it led directly, like an accusing finger, to the site of Sarah's death. Alastair felt a wave of dizziness. He gripped the edge of the table, the old wood cool beneath his palms. Coincidence? It had to be. A cartographic error. A draftsman's fantasy. Or perhaps Thorne himself had added it, for some unfathomable reason. But the print quality matched the rest of the map perfectly. It wasn't a hand-drawn edition. He looked closer, his heart hammering. The intersection itself, on Thorne's map, was subtly different too. The blind bend seemed less severe. The sightlines appeared clearer. If this configuration had been real. A horrifying thought, insidious and sharp, pierced through his confusion. If that road had existed, if that junction had been different, would Sarah still be alive? Could she have taken that route? Would she have seen the lorry sooner? He pushed the thought away, guilt and a fresh wave of grief washing over him. This was madness. He was overwrought, sleep-deprived, isolated. He was seeing patterns that weren't there, imbuing a simple piece of paper with a significance it couldn't possibly possess. But the road remained. Stark. Unwavering. Leading to the place where his world had ended. He spent the rest of the day in a daze, unable to concentrate on anything else. He kept returning to the study, to the map, half expecting the anomalous road to have vanished, to have been a figment of his tormented imagination. But it was always there, a silent, ink and paper accusation. That night, sleep was impossible. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw the map, that phantom road, superimposed over the flashing blue lights and twisted metal of his nightmares. He found himself thinking about Elias Thorne, the reclusive surveyor. What kind of man keeps a map like this? Was it just one of many oddities in a vast collection, or did it hold some specific, personal meaning for him too? Alastair felt a growing unease, a sense that Thorncroft and its contents were not merely old and eccentric, but actively, subtly, wrong. The house seemed to be watching him, waiting. And the maps were beginning to feel less like passive records of the world, and more like something else entirely. Something that knew. The first anomaly had revealed itself. And Alastair had a chilling premonition that it would not be the last. Part 2, Escalating Anomalies and Bleed-Through. Chapter 4, Whispers on Vellum. The phantom road on the Surrey map became Alastair's obsession. He couldn't leave it alone. He spread it out on Thorne's large table each morning, studying it with a mixture of dread and a strange, unhealthy fascination. He cross-referenced it with every other map of Surrey in the collection, a dozen or more, spanning different eras. None of them showed the anomalous B-road. It was unique to that single, well-worn ordnance survey sheet. He examined the ink under a magnifying glass he found amongst Thorne's tools. The road itself, the lines, the numbering, seemed identical in quality and slight fading to the rest of the printed features. It wasn't a later edition, not one he could detect. Yet, its very presence felt like a fresh wound on the paper, raw and insistent. A week after its discovery, Alastair noticed something else. He was comparing the anomalous map with a more recent one when he frowned. The ink of the phantom road, and the area around the fatal intersection, seemed darker. More vibrant than he remembered. As if someone had subtly, painstakingly, re-inked it overnight. He ran his finger over it. Smooth. No textural difference. He told himself it was the light, his tired eyes playing tricks. But the unsettling feeling lingered. The anomalies began to multiply, subtly at first, like whispers on vellum. He was cataloging a series of hand-drawn coastal charts of the Oakhaven area, Thorne's meticulous work. On one, depicting the coastline just south of the town, a small cove appeared that Alastair was sure hadn't been there when he'd first examined it. He knew this stretch of coast from his walks, it was all sheer cliffs and unforgiving shingle. He took the map out with him the next day, scrambling over slippery rocks, referencing the landmarks Thorne had so precisely noted. There was no cove. Just the relentless, grey sea gnawing at the base of the cliffs. When he returned to the study, chilled and disheartened, the cove on the map seemed fainter, as if receding. Another day, he was looking at a geological survey map of a remote part of the Scottish Highlands, a place he'd once dreamed of hiking with Sarah. He noticed the contour lines around a particular Munro seemed to have shifted, subtly altering its peak, making it appear more formidable, more treacherous. He checked it against an official survey map online. Thorne's version was definitely different. Had it always been? He couldn't be sure. His memory felt increasingly unreliable, eroded by grief and the insidious strangeness of the house. The study itself felt more charged. The sensation of being watched intensified, especially when he was deeply engrossed in a map. Sometimes, he'd hear it, the faintest scratch, as of a pen nib moving across paper, even when he was perfectly still. He'd whirl around, heart pounding, but the room would be empty, silent save for the sigh of the wind. The shadows in the corners seemed deeper, and sometimes, out of the corner of his eye, he'd think he saw them lengthen or shift when no light source had changed. He started talking to himself, a low murmur of questions and anxieties. "Did you draw this, Thorn? What does it mean?" The silence of the room was his only reply, but it felt like a listening silence. One afternoon, he was staring at the Surrey map. The phantom wrote a dark scar on his consciousness. He was tracing its impossible path with his finger, a path Sarah could never have taken, when he heard a distinct sigh, seemingly from right behind him. Not the wind. This was a human sound. Laden with sorrow, or perhaps, resignation. He spun around, a cry caught in his throat. Nothing. Just the towering bookshelves, the dust motes dancing in the weak sunlight. But the air was icy cold, and the scent of old ink and something else, something like damp earth or an open grave, was suddenly, overwhelmingly strong. He fled the study, his breath coming in ragged gasps. He stood in the hallway, leaning against the wall, trying to control the tremor in his hands. This wasn't just grief anymore. This house, these maps, they were actively unsettling him, preying on his vulnerable state. He considered leaving Oakhaven, selling Thorncroft, finding somewhere bland and modern, free of ghosts and their cartographic legacies. But the thought of packing up again, of facing the world outside, was unbearable. And a perverse part of him, a dark curiosity he was ashamed to acknowledge, wanted to understand. Wanted to know what was happening. The phantom road, the shifting coastlines, the whispering paper, they were pieces of a puzzle, and Elias Thorne held the key. Alistair felt, with a growing, chilling certainty, that the maps weren't just showing him things. They were trying to tell him something. Or perhaps, lure him somewhere. Chapter 5, The Scent of Salt and Regret. The bleed-through began insidiously, small sensory illusions that Alistair initially dismissed as products of his overactive imagination and heightened emotional state. He'd be in the study, poring over the Surrey map, his gaze fixed on the impossible road leading to Sarah's death, and a faint smell would drift into his awareness. Not the usual dusty paper and old ink. This was sharper, acrid, the distinct smell of diesel fumes, hot metal, and something sickeningly sweet that he knew, with a lurch of his stomach, was the smell of spilled coolant and blood. He'd recoil, his hand flying to his mouth, the illusory scent making him gag. He'd throw open the study window, gulping in the clean, cold sea air, but the phantom smells would linger for minutes, clinging to the back of his throat. When he unfolded a particularly beautiful, hand-tinted map of the Cornish coast, a place he and Sarah had spent a blissful holiday years ago, the change was different. The briny tang of the Oakhaven sea air in the room would suddenly intensify, becoming sharper, tinged with the scent of seaweed and distant fishing boats, exactly as he remembered it from that trip. He could almost hear the distinctive cry of the Cornish gulls, the rhythmic crash of Atlantic rollers against granite cliffs, sounds subtly different from the North Sea's grumble outside his window. He'd close his eyes, and for a fleeting moment, he'd be there, Sarah's hand in his, the sun warm on his face. Then he'd open them, and the study would reassert itself, gray and silent, the illusion fading like a dream. One afternoon, he found a botanical atlas, its pages filled with exquisite, hand-colored plates of flowers. He paused at a drawing of a lady's slipper orchid, a rare, delicate bloom Sarah had adored. They'd once seen one, on a walk in the Yorkshire Dales, a moment of shared wonder. As he gazed at the illustration, a faint, sweet perfume, earthy and delicate, filled the air. He looked down at his desk. Lying beside the open atlas was a single, perfectly formed lady's slipper orchid. It was unquestionably real, its velvety pouch a deep maroon, its petals a pale, speckled yellow. His heart hammered. He reached out a trembling finger to touch it. It was cool, its petals soft as silk. Where had it come from? He hadn't left the room. There were no flowers like that in the overgrown garden. He blinked, and when he looked again, it was gone. Vanished. The faint perfume lingered for a moment longer, then dissipated, leaving only the scent of old paper. He searched the desk, the floor, his pockets. Nothing. Had he imagined it? The vision had been so vivid, so tangible. The bleed-through wasn't confined to smells and sounds. Small objects, depicted on the maps or related to the memories they evoked, began to manifest, always briefly, always when he was alone and deeply immersed in the cartographic world. A tarnished silver locket, identical to one Sarah had lost on that Cornish holiday, appeared on the corner of the map he was studying, only to dematerialize when he tried to pick it up. A specific type of seashell, sketched in the margin of one of Thorne's coastal charts, crunched faintly under his heel as he crossed the study floor, but when he looked down, there was nothing but bare boards. These manifestations were fleeting, ephemeral, like waking dreams. They left Alistair shaken, questioning his sanity. Was he losing his grip on reality? Was the grief finally breaking him, conjuring these sensory ghosts? Or was it the house, the maps, somehow projecting these things into his perception? He started to dread going into the study, yet he couldn't stay away. The maps called to him, their silent paper landscapes promising, what? Answers? Solace? Or deeper madness? He tried to focus on his urban planning work, sketching out road layouts for a hypothetical new town development, trying to ground himself in the logic and precision of his profession. But even there, the lines on his paper seemed to waver, the neat grids threatening to dissolve into the chaotic, unpredictable topographies of Thorne's collection. One evening, he was looking at a detailed street plan of their old London neighborhood. He'd been tracing the route Sarah would have taken from their flat to the local bakery she loved, a Saturday morning ritual they'd shared. Suddenly, the aroma of freshly baked bread, warm and yeasty, filled the study. So potent, so real, it made his stomach ache with a hunger that was more for the past than for food. He could almost hear the cheerful chatter of the bakery, Sarah's laugh as she chose her favorite pain of chocolate. Tears pricked his eyes. He slammed the map shut, the sound echoing in the oppressive stillness. "Stop it," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "Just stop it." But the house, the maps, Elias Thorne's lingering presence, they didn't seem inclined to listen. The bleed-through was becoming more insistent, the veil between memory and reality, between the mapped world and his own, growing perilously thin. He felt like he was standing on the edge of a precipice, the ground crumbling beneath his feet, with Thorne's ghostly hand gently, inexorably, pushing him towards the edge. Chapter 6, Thorne's Shadow. The feeling of being watched in the study evolved into something more tangible, more unnervingly personal. It wasn't just a general sense of presence anymore, it felt specifically focused on him, on his interactions with the maps and Elias Thorne's equipment. He'd leave the theodolite carefully covered with a dust sheet. Its lens cap on, only to find the sheet slightly askew the next morning, the brass barrel angled towards a different part of the room, as if it had been moved, used. Once, he found it aimed directly at the Surrey map, which lay open on the table. The eyepiece was inexplicably cold to the touch, despite the mildness of the day. The heavy Gunter's chains, which he'd meticulously coiled and placed on a shelf, would sometimes be found lying in a slightly different configuration, a link or two unhooked, as if someone had been handling them. The compasses on the table would occasionally quiver when he approached, their needles twitching erratically before settling, always pointing to true north, or what he assumed was true north within the unsettling confines of Thorncroft. One morning, after a particularly heavy rainstorm during the night, he found faint, muddy boot prints on the wooden floor of the study. They were small, neat prints, not his own large, clumsy ones. They led from the window, which was closed and locked, towards the central map table, circled it once, and then simply stopped, a few feet from the chair where he usually sat. As if the walker had dematerialized. He checked the window, the frame, the surrounding area. No sign of forced entry. No mud anywhere else in the house. By midday, the prints had faded, leaving only faint, damp stains that were gone by evening. The house itself seemed to collude with these strange occurrences. The temperature in the study would plummet unexpectedly when he tried to ignore the maps for a day, focusing instead on his own abortive attempts at work or trying to read. The chill would emanate from the map table, a palpable coldness that seeped into his bones, urging him back to Thorn's legacy. Driven by a growing unease, Alastair decided to research Elias Thorne. He visited Oakhaven's tiny local library, a dusty room above the post office run by a voluble elderly woman named Mrs. Paisley. Elias Thorne. Mrs. Paisley's eyes, magnified by thick spectacles, widened. "Oh, a curious man, Mr. Finch. Brilliant," they said. "Came here, oh, must be 40 years ago now. Bought the old Hetherington place, Thorncroft, as he renamed it. Kept to himself mostly, especially after," she paused, lowering her voice conspiratorially. "Well, after the tragedy." "Tragedy?" Alastair prompted, his interest piqued. "His wife and little girl," Mrs. Paisley sighed, shaking her head. "Dreadful business. Drowned, they did. A boating accident, just off the point. Nasty current there, even on a calm day. Thorne was on the shore, saw the whole thing, apparently. Helpless. Changed him, it did. He was always a quiet man, but after that, he became a proper recluse. Never saw him in the village unless he absolutely had to pick up supplies. Just him and his maps." Alastair felt a cold knot tighten in his chest. Another man, broken by loss, retreating into a world of lines and symbols. He wondered if Thorne's obsession with cartography had begun before, or if it was a consequence of his grief, a way to map the contours of his own sorrow, to find some order in the chaos of bereavement. Did he ever talk about his work? Alastair asked. "The maps?" "Not to anyone I know," Mrs. Paisley said. "He was polite enough, when you did see him, but distant. Like his mind was always somewhere else. Surveying, that was his life. Always out on the marshes or the cliffs with his strange instruments. Some said he was mapping more than just the land. Said he was looking for something else." She tapped the side of her nose. "Old tales. You know how village folk talk." He found a few old newspaper clippings in the library's local history section. One, dated 38 years prior, reported the drowning deaths of Amelia Thorne, 32, and Lily Thorne, 7. A brief, tragic paragraph. Another, from a few years later, was a small feature on local eccentrics, mentioning Elias Thorne, the Hermit of Thorncroft, whose intricate maps of the Essex coastline are said to be unparalleled in their detail, though rarely seen by outsiders. There was no photograph of him. The knowledge of Thorne's own devastating loss cast a new, unsettling light on the strange happenings in the study. Was this Thorne's grief, somehow imprinted on the house, on the maps? Was he trying to communicate, to share his sorrow, or was it something more malevolent, a lingering resentment, a desire not to be alone in his spectral, mapped world? That evening, back in the oppressive silence of Thorncroft, Alastair felt Thorne's shadow more acutely than ever. He sat in the study, the Surrey map before him, the phantom road seeming to pulse faintly in the lamplight. He imagined Thorne, decades ago, sitting in this very chair, his heart shattered, perhaps trying to draw a different reality, a map where his wife and daughter were safe, a path they hadn't taken. Alastair shivered. He wasn't just cataloguing a dead man's possessions. He was sifting through the layers of a profound and enduring sorrow, a sorrow that seemed to have soaked into the very fabric of the house, into the ink and paper of the maps themselves. And it was beginning to feel contagious. Chapter 7, The Compulsion to Chart. A subtle but undeniable shift occurred within Alastair. The initial fear and confusion surrounding the maps began to mingle with a strange, unsettling compulsion. It started as a faint intellectual itch, the urban planner in him wanting to understand the anomalies, to correct the perceived errors on Thorne's charts. He'd find himself staring at the phantom road on the Surrey map, an almost irresistible urge building within him to take one of Thorne's drafting pens and redraw the junction as it truly was, to erase the impossible B-road. He'd pick up a pen, its cool metal familiar in his hand, hover the nib over the paper, and then a wave of profound reluctance would wash over him. It felt wrong, like a desecration. As if the map itself resisted the correction. Once, he did try, making a small, tentative mark with a fine-nibbed pen. The ink beaded on the surface, refusing to soak in, and when he looked again a few minutes later, his mark had faded to an almost invisible smudge. Conversely, when a new, faint pathway appeared on the map of the Oakhaven coastline, leading towards the non-existent cove, he felt a strange pull to trace it, to make it clearer, more defined. As if he were being invited to collaborate, to participate in this strange, evolving cartography. The compulsion wasn't always about correction or enhancement. Sometimes, it was an urge to follow. The path to the Phantom Cove, for instance. He found himself dressing in his walking boots, a strange sense of anticipation thrumming through him, before common sense, and a healthy dose of fear, would reassert itself. What would he find if he followed a path that only existed on paper? The maps seemed to sense his resistance. When he actively tried to ignore them, spending a whole day away from the study, the phenomena would intensify. The cold in the room would become biting, the scratching sounds more insistent, the feeling of being watched almost unbearable. One afternoon, he returned to the study after a long, fruitless walk along the beach, deliberately trying to clear his head of Thorn and his cursed cartography. He found a new map laid out on the central table, one he hadn't seen before. Or rather, it was a stark, unervingly accurate architectural plan of Thorncroft itself. Not an old, historical blueprint, but a contemporary rendering, showing the current layout, his own few pieces of furniture sketched in with disturbing precision. A chill snaked down his spine. He hadn't drawn this. Had Thorn? But how could it be so current? As he stared, horrified, a tiny, red ink dot appeared on the plan, marking the kitchen, where he'd made coffee less than an hour ago. He watched, mesmerized, as the dot slowly faded, and a new one appeared, marking the hallway, then the foot of the stairs. It was tracking his movements. He backed away, his breath catching in his throat. The map was live. It knew where he was. Then, a fine, spidery red line began to draw itself on the plan, originating from the symbol for his bed in the master bedroom. It snaked out of the room, along the upstairs corridor, down the stairs, and directly into the study, ending at the chair before the map table. An invitation? A command? He felt a surge of panic, but beneath it, something else, a dawning, terrifying understanding. The maps weren't passive. They were an interface, a system, and they demanded interaction. They were feeding off something, his attention, his emotional turmoil, perhaps even his expertise as a planner. The most disturbing development came a few days later. He'd been staring at a particularly abstract map, one that seemed to depict not a physical landscape but something more akin to an emotional or psychological terrain. It was a confusing swirl of colors, lines that intersected and diverged like neural pathways, and strange symbols he couldn't decipher. Thorn's notes in the margin were cryptic: topography of regret, fault lines of sorrow, the weight of unchosen paths. As Alastair looked at it, trying to make sense of its bizarre geography, he felt a profound wave of his own grief wash over him, so intense it buckled his knees. His regret about the small, stupid argument he'd had with Sarah the morning she died, a memory he tried desperately to suppress, rose up with unbearable clarity. And on the map, a dark, jagged line, like a crack in the earth, seemed to deepen, to spread across a previously blank section of the paper. An area of the map that resonated with his specific pain seemed to pulse with a faint, sickly light. This map wasn't just charting some abstract concept of regret, it was charting his regret. It was becoming increasingly personal, invasive, a mirror reflecting the darkest corners of his grieving mind. He felt a desperate need to alter it, to smooth over that jagged line, to redraw his emotional landscape into something less painful, less broken. He picked up a blue pencil, his hand shaking, and tried to sketch a new, gentler pathway across the fault line of sorrow. The pencil lead snapped. The compulsion was no longer just an intellectual curiosity or a fleeting urge. It was becoming a gnawing hunger, a desperate need to engage with these impossible charts, to understand their terrifying language, even if it meant losing himself in their depths. The maps were drawing him in, and Alastair, lost in his grief and the growing mystery of Thorncroft, was finding it increasingly difficult to resist their silent, insistent call. Part 3, Deeper Immersion and Confrontation. Chapter 8, Walking into Memory. The line between the mapped world and Alistair's reality grew increasingly porous, the bleed-through effect escalating from fleeting sensory illusions to something far more immersive and unsettling. He'd be in the study, the chill of the room a constant companion, when the light would subtly change. The weak Essex sunlight filtering through the grimy window would momentarily intensify, then shift to the harsh, metallic glare of fluorescent strip lighting he associated with the hospital where Sarah had been taken. The scent of antiseptic and old linoleum would fill his nostrils, sharp and unwelcome. He'd blink, and the study would be itself again, but the echo of the hospital corridor, the hushed, urgent voices, would linger in his mind. One afternoon, he was examining a framed map of their old London borough that hung on the study wall, a gift he'd given Sarah years ago. He'd been tracing the streets with his finger, lost in a reverie of happier times. As he gazed at the glass, his own reflection seemed to waver, and for a horrifying instant, Sarah's face looked back at him, not smiling, but pale, her eyes wide with a silent, desperate plea. He gasped, stumbling back, his heart leaping into his throat. When he looked again, there was only his own haggard reflection, the ghostly image gone as quickly as it had appeared. But the terror, and a fresh, sharp spike of grief, remained. The most disturbing episodes occurred when he was physically interacting with certain maps, particularly those tied to potent memories. He had spread out a detailed AZ map of central London, open to the page showing the theatre district. He and Sarah had loved the theatre. He touched the tiny square marking the Apollo Theatre, remembering a night they'd seen a dazzling musical, laughing until their sides ached. Suddenly, the study around him flickered, like a faulty projection. The dusty bookshelves, the scarred table, Thorne's instruments, they didn't disappear, but they seemed to recede, to become translucent. In their place, superimposed like a ghostly overlay, were the plush red velvet seats of the Apollo, the ornate gilded proscenium arch, the murmur of an expectant audience. He could smell popcorn and stale perfume. He felt the familiar thrill of anticipation, the house lights dimming. He cried out, snatching his hand back from the map as if it were burning. The illusion shattered instantly. He was back in the cold, silent study, his breath sawing in his chest, the map lying innocently on the table. He was walking into his memories. Or rather, the maps were pulling him into them, forcing him to re-experience moments from his past with a vividness that was both seductive and terrifying. It was no longer just sights and smells, it was a full sensory immersion, a brief, terrifying temporal displacement. He started to become wary of touching the maps, handling them with a new caution. Yet, the compulsion to interact, to explore, remained, a dangerous counterpoint to his fear. He found himself drawn to the Surrey map, to the Phantom Road, more and more often. What would happen if he truly engaged with that one? If he let himself walk into that landscape? The thought filled him with a dread so profound it was almost paralyzing, yet it held a dark, irresistible allure. Could he see her? Could he change anything? He knew, with chilling certainty, that these were dangerous thoughts. He was teetering on the edge of something, a precipice of sanity. The house, the maps, Thorne's legacy, they were not just passive remnants. They were an active, insidious force, and they were drawing him deeper into their uncanny embrace. He had to fight it, to find an anchor in reality. But reality itself was becoming increasingly difficult to define within the warped confines of Thorncroft. Chapter 9, The Cartographer's Journal. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Alistair renewed his search for something, anything, that might explain Elias Thorne's obsessive cartography and the increasingly bizarre phenomena plaguing Thorncroft. He'd been through the obvious drawers and boxes in the study, finding only survey logs and technical manuals. But surely, a man so consumed by his work, so deeply affected by personal tragedy, must have left some more personal record, some clue to his mindset. He began a meticulous search of the study, tapping panels, checking behind the tightly packed bookshelves, even prying up a loose floorboard he discovered beneath the main map table. Nothing. Then, one evening, as he was replacing a heavy, leather-bound tome on an upper shelf, his fingers brushed against something tucked deep into the recess behind the books. It was a small, unassuming notebook, bound in faded black leather, its pages brittle and yellowed with age. There was no title on the spine, no indication of its contents. With trembling hands, Alastair brought it down to the light of the desk lamp. He opened it carefully. The first page was blank, but the second bore Thorn's familiar spidery handwriting, tighter and more erratic than in his formal survey logs. This was no technical manual. This was a journal. He sank into Thorn's worn leather chair, the journal open before him, a sense of both excitement and trepidation coursing through him. The entries were sporadic, dated over many years, beginning shortly after the death of his wife and daughter. October 17th, Amelia and Lily are gone. The sea took them. I saw it. The lines on the chart were clear, the currents marked. But the sea does not always obey the lines men draw. It has its own maps, its own merciless geography. Alastair's breath hitched. He read on, deciphering Thorn's cramped script, his heart growing heavier with each entry. November 5th. The house is silent. Their laughter echoes only in my head. I have begun to map the silence. To chart the emptiness. Can grief itself be surveyed? Can sorrow be measured and delineated? Thorn's early entries were filled with raw, unadulterated pain. A mirror of Alastair's own recent experiences. But as the years passed, the tone shifted. The grief remained, a constant undertow, but it became interwoven with his cartographic obsession in increasingly strange ways. March 2nd. I find discrepancies. Minor at first. A path where none should be. A coastline subtly altered. Not errors in my surveying, but shifts. As if the land itself remembers, or regrets. Or perhaps, it is I who impress my sorrow upon the vellum, and the vellum, in turn, impresses itself upon the world. July 10th. The maps are no longer static. They breathe. They change. I have charted a road that was never built, a pathway to a might have been. When I concentrate, I can almost smell the dust of its non-existent verges. Alastair's eyes widened. The phantom road on the Surrey map. Thorn had known. He had perhaps even created it, or witnessed its creation. September 21st. I call it topography of sorrow. The emotional landscape. It can be charted, I am sure of it. The fault lines of regret, the peaks of fleeting joy, the vast, barren plains of loss. The house seems to amplify these energies. It is a conduit, an anchor point between what is, what was, and what could never be. A conduit. An anchor. The words resonated ominously with Alastair. Thorn wasn't just mapping land, he was attempting to map something far more ephemeral, far more dangerous. May 4th. The bleed-through is stronger now. Objects from memory, from the maps, appearing briefly. Scents. Sounds. I saw Lily's doll on my desk today. Just for a moment. It was a comfort, and a torment. January 12th. I fear I am losing myself in these lines. The maps demand interaction. They draw me in. Sometimes, I feel I am walking within them, reliving moments, trying to find a different path, a different outcome. But the past is a stubborn territory, resistant to resurveying. The later entries became more fragmented, more desperate. Thorn wrote of feeling a presence, of the equipment moving, of a growing compulsion he couldn't control. He mentioned trying to find a way to sever the anchor, or to complete the final map, a map that would somehow resolve the unbearable tension, offer release. June 30th. It wants more than memory. It wants participation. It wants a new surveyor. I am tired. The lines blur. Am I mapping the world, or is the world, in its sorrow, mapping me. The last entry was brief, almost illegible, dated only a few weeks before Thorne's death was officially recorded. The uncharted territory beckons. It draws itself. A path forward, or a path into oblivion? I must follow. There is no other way now. The ink is set. Alastair closed the journal, his hands shaking. This was no mere collection of maps. Thorne had stumbled into something, or perhaps created something, profoundly disturbing. A nexus of grief, memory, and cartographic power, anchored to this house, to these very charts. And Thorne, in his desperate attempt to navigate his sorrow, had become lost within it, consumed by it. The journal didn't offer easy answers, but it confirmed Alastair's terrifying suspicions. He was not going mad, or at least, not entirely on his own. He was caught in the same web that had ensnared Elias Thorne. The question now was whether he could find a way out, or if he was destined to become the next entry in Thorncroft's tragic, mapped history. The phrase, the uncharted territory, echoed in his mind, filled with a chilling premonition. Chapter 10, The Unsettling Gaze. The discovery of Thorne's journal, instead of bringing clarity, plunged Alastair deeper into the heart of the mystery, making the surveyor's presence feel more immediate, more intentional. It was no longer just the house's ambient strangeness, it was Thorne himself, or some conscious echo of him, that seemed to interact with Alastair. He started catching fleeting glimpses of a figure in his peripheral vision, tall, gaunt, dressed in dark, old-fashioned clothing. When he turned, there was nothing, just the play of shadows or a coat slung over a chair. But the impression was vivid, unsettlingly real. He'd see a pale face reflected for a split second in the glass of a framed map, eyes that seemed to hold an eternity of sorrow and a keen, unnerving intelligence. The scratching sounds in the study became clearer, more purposeful. No longer just a faint rustle, but the distinct, rhythmic stroke of a pen, the decisive click of an inkwell lid. He'd burst into the room, convinced he'd catch Thorne in the act, but it would always be empty, the air still vibrating with a recent presence, the scent of fresh ink tantalizingly strong. One morning, he found a new annotation on the Surrey map, beside the Phantom Road. In Thorne's spidery script, almost too faint to read, were the words, a possible divergence. A path considered, then abandoned. Alastair hadn't seen this note before. It was as if Thorne was commenting on Alastair's own obsessive focus on that particular anomaly, guiding his thoughts, or perhaps, torturing him with possibilities. The surveying equipment became more overtly involved. He'd find the theodolite precisely aimed at a specific map he'd been studying the previous day, as if Thorne had been reviewing his work or directing his attention. The delicate needles of the planimeters would sometimes trace invisible lines across blank sheets of paper left on the table, their movements tiny and precise, as if measuring unseen landscapes. The most chilling incident occurred one night. Alastair had fallen into an uneasy, dream-filled sleep, the journal's revelations replaying in his mind. He woke with a start, a sense of profound unease filling the cold bedroom. His bedside lamp was off, though he was sure he'd left it on. He fumbled for the switch, his heart pounding. As the light flickered on, he saw it. Lying on his bedside table, next to the framed photograph of Sarah, which he'd since turned face up again, a small act of defiance, was one of Elias Thorne's antique fountain pens. It was a beautiful, ebonist Waterman, one he'd admired in its velvet-lined box in the study. It shouldn't have been there. He stared at it, a cold dread seeping into him. He hadn't touched it, hadn't moved it from the study. As he watched, a single, perfect droplet of dark blue ink welled from its nib and fell onto the polished wood of the table, staining it like a teardrop. He scrambled out of bed, his legs unsteady, and hurried to the study. The door was slightly ajar, a sliver of moonlight cutting across the floor. He pushed it open. The room was cold, the air thick with the smell of ink and something else, an old, musty smell, like dried flowers or forgotten books. On the central table, the Surrey map lay open, illuminated by the moonlight. And there, on the map, was a fresh mark. A tiny, new line, drawn in dark blue ink, branching off from the main A317 just before the fatal intersection. It was a small, almost insignificant detour, a loop that bypassed the blind bend and rejoined the road further on. A route Sarah could have taken, if it had existed, if she had known. Alistair felt the blood drain from his face. Thorn. It had to be Thorn. Offering him a revision. A glimpse of an alternative. Or was it a cruel taunt, a reminder of the infinitely branching paths of fate, the tiny decisions that could lead to life or death? His guilt, already a crushing weight, intensified. The argument they'd had that morning, if he hadn't been so stubborn, if she hadn't left upset, would she have been driving less attentively? Would a small detour have made any difference? The questions were a fresh torment. He backed away from the map, from the pen, from Thorn's palpable, sorrowful presence. The surveyor wasn't just a ghost in the machine of the house, he was an active participant, his gaze unsettling, his intentions terrifyingly ambiguous. Was he trying to help Alistair, to guide him through his own topography of sorrow? Or was he trying to draw him into the same mapped prison that had claimed him, seeking a successor, a companion in his endless, regretful cartography? Alistair no longer felt like he was merely inhabiting Thorn's house. He felt like he was being surveyed, measured, and inexorably drawn onto Thorn's most personal, most terrifying map. Chapter 11, The Map of What Could Be / What Will Be. The subtle cues and ghostly interactions coalesced into a terrifying new focal point. It began not with an existing map, but with a blank sheet of high-quality cartographer's vellum Alistair had found amongst Thorn's supplies. He'd left it on the large table one evening, intending to perhaps sketch out some ideas for his Oakhaven garden, a desperate attempt at normalcy. The next morning, it was no longer blank. Faint lines, like silver point on aged paper, had begun to appear. At first, Alistair thought it was a trick of the light, or some chemical reaction in the old vellum. But as the day wore on, the lines grew clearer, darker, coalescing into a recognizable, yet utterly alien, geography. It wasn't a map of Oakhaven, or Surrey, or any place Alistair knew or could find in Thorn's extensive collection. This was something new, something emerging from the void. It depicted a stark, desolate landscape. Jagged peaks, like broken teeth, clawed at a perpetually twilit sky. Rivers flowed like black ink through barren plains. There were no towns, no roads, no signs of human habitation, only strange, geometric structures that looked like mausoleums or forgotten altars, scattered across the bleak terrain. The compass rose in the corner was unconventional, its points skewed, its north unsettlingly misaligned with anything Alistair understood. He watched, horrified and fascinated, as new details resolved themselves throughout the day. A network of faint pathways, almost invisible, snaked between the structures. A vast, dark lake, its surface like polished obsidian, mirrored the oppressive sky. The lines seemed to draw themselves, with no visible hand guiding them, the ink appearing as if from within the vellum itself. This wasn't a map of a place that was, or even a place that had been. This felt like a map of somewhere else entirely. An uncharted territory, just as Thorn's journal had forewarned. Or perhaps, Alistair thought with a chilling lurch of his stomach, it was a map of what will be. His gaze was drawn to a central point on this emerging chart, a nexus where several of the faint pathways converged. There, a particularly large, foreboding structure was slowly taking shape, its architecture both alien and disturbingly familiar, echoing the sharp gables and narrow windows of Thorncroft itself, but twisted, magnified, into something monstrous. As he stared at this structure, a profound sense of dread washed over him, colder and more potent than anything he had experienced before. This map wasn't just an abstract representation, it felt like a destination. A summons. He tried to move the vellum, to put it away, but his hands wouldn't obey. He felt rooted to the spot, compelled to watch as this terrifying landscape unfurled before him. The air in the study grew heavy, charged with an almost electrical tension. The usual sounds of the house, the creaks, the wind, faded, replaced by a low, almost subaudible hum that seemed to emanate from the map itself. It pulsed with a faint, cold light, visible even in the dim afternoon. Was this what Thorn had followed? Was this the final map he'd mentioned? A path into oblivion? Over the next few days, the map continued to evolve. One horrifying detail emerged, a tiny, barely perceptible figure, sketched at the entrance of one of the desolate pathways leading towards the monstrous, Thorncroft-like edifice. The figure was hunched, solitary, its posture one of utter despair. Alistair couldn't make out its features, but he knew, with a certainty that froze his blood, who it was meant to represent. Himself. This map wasn't just charting an unknown land, it was charting his future, a bleak, terrifying trajectory leading towards the heart of this desolate, mapped world. The compulsion to interact, which had previously been a subtle urge, now became an overwhelming force. He felt an undeniable pull towards this new map, a desperate need to understand it, to engage with it, even as every instinct screamed at him to flee. It was as if the map itself had a gravitational field, drawing him into its bleak orbit. He thought of Sarah, of the life they'd lost. Was this where his grief was leading him? To this empty, lightless place? Was this the ultimate geography of regret? The question of what to do became agonizing. Could he destroy this map? Would that break the connection, end the torment? Or would it unleash something worse? Could he resist its pull, leave Thorncroft and its cursed legacy behind? Or was he already too enmeshed, too much a part of this strange, sorrowful cartography? The map lay on the table, a stark, undeniable ultimatum. Follow, or be consumed. The uncharted territory was waiting, and its lines were drawing Alistair Finch inexorably towards its desolate heart. Chapter 12, The Crossroads. The self-drawing map of the uncharted territory lay on Thorn's table like a death sentence. Alistair felt trapped, standing at a terrifying crossroads with no obvious safe path. Every option seemed fraught with peril. His first instinct, primal and desperate, was to destroy it. If this map was charting a horrifying future, then surely its destruction would negate that future. One evening, fueled by a surge of panic defiance, he snatched the vellum sheet from the table. It felt strangely cold, yet vibrated with a faint energy in his hands. He carried it to the old iron stove in the kitchen, its firebox cold and empty. He crumpled the map, the vellum surprisingly resistant, like trying to crush thin sheet metal. He forced it into the stove, then fumbled for matches. His hands were shaking so violently he could barely strike one. Finally, a flame caught. He thrust it towards the crumpled vellum. The paper smoldered, turned black at the edges, but refused to catch fire properly. A wisp of acrid smoke, smelling not of burning paper but of something metallic and ozone-like, curled upwards. The lines of the map, even on the charred sections, seemed to glow with a faint, malevolent light. Then, the flame on his match died, and the smoldering stopped. He pulled the vellum out. It was scorched, brittle, but largely intact. The desolate landscape was still visible, perhaps even clearer against the blackened background. Defeated, he returned to the study and smoothed out the damaged map. As he watched, horrified, the scorched marks began to fade, the vellum slowly repairing itself, the lines reasserting their dark clarity. Within an hour, it looked as if it had never been touched by fire. Destroying it, it seemed, was not an option. The maps were not merely paper, they were something far more resilient, more supernatural. What about leaving? Selling Thorncroft, walking away from Oakhaven, from Thorn's entire cursed legacy. He packed a bag, his movements jerky, frantic. He threw clothes, toiletries, Thorn's journal into it. He would drive until he ran out of petrol, find a new town, a new life, anonymous and map-free. He got as far as the front door, his hand on the heavy iron latch. But an invisible force seemed to hold him back. A profound lethargy washed over him, his limbs heavy as lead. The thought of facing the outside world, of explaining his flight, of starting over yet again, was utterly overwhelming. And a deeper, more insidious thought whispered in his mind: what if the maps followed him? What if this wasn't tied to the house, but to him? Thorn's journal had spoken of the house as an anchor, but what if Alistair himself had become a new anchor point? He slumped against the door, defeated. He couldn't leave. He was tethered to this place, to these charts. The new map continued its relentless self-creation, its desolate landscape growing more detailed, more menacing. The tiny figure he'd identified as himself had moved, infinitesimally, further along one of the bleak pathways towards the monstrous, Thorncroft-like structure at its heart. It was a clock, counting down to some terrible denouement. His gaze fell upon Thorn's surveying equipment, gathering dust in the corner. The theodolite, the chains, the compasses. Thorn had used these tools to navigate, to understand, to chart. Could they be used to fight back? To understand the uncharted territory, perhaps even to alter it? Or would using them only draw him deeper in, make him more like Thorn? Thorn's journal mentioned an anchor within the house. If he could find it, could he sever the connection? But what was it? The house itself? The collection of maps? Or something more specific, more hidden? He searched again, frantically, tapping walls, checking the cellar, the attic, looking for hollow spaces, unusual fixtures, anything that might serve as a focal point for such potent, strange energy. He found nothing but dust and decay. The only remaining option, it seemed, was the one Thorn himself had apparently taken, to follow the map. To walk into the uncharted territory. The thought filled him with a dread that was almost physically painful. But what else was there? To wait, passive, as the map drew him towards his doom. He felt like a character in one of Sarah's beloved fantasy novels, facing an impossible quest. But this was no grand adventure, this was a descent into a landscape of pure sorrow and fear. He spent hours staring at the uncharted territory map, trying to discern some logic, some weakness, some hope within its bleak lines. He traced the paths with his finger, a strange compulsion guiding him. The map felt cold beneath his touch, but also, responsive. As if it sensed his attention, his fear, his reluctant consideration. The crossroads was no longer a choice between multiple paths. It felt as if all other routes had been systematically closed off, leaving only one, the terrifying, unknown path into the heart of the map itself. The lines were drawn. The destination was set. The only question was whether he would walk it willingly, or be dragged. Part 4, The Climax and Resolution. Chapter 13, Into the Uncharted. The decision, when it finally came, was less a conscious choice and more a weary surrender. Alistair could no longer bear the oppressive weight of the watching house, the relentless progression of the uncharted territory map, the gnawing fear of what awaited him. If this was his fate, then he would meet it head-on, rather than cower in the dwindling light of his sanity. He chose an evening when a storm was brewing out at sea. The wind howled around Thorncroft, rattling the windows like skeletal fingers, a fitting soundtrack to his descent. He dressed warmly, as if for an Arctic expedition, though he knew no physical cold could match the chill emanating from the map. In the study, he gathered some of Thorn's tools, not entirely sure why, but feeling a strange compulsion to do so. He took a heavy brass compass, its needle quivering erratically, and one of the surveyor's worn leather field bags, into which he placed the journal and a small, powerful flashlight. He didn't know if these objects would have any power or utility where he was going, but they felt like tenuous links to a world he was about to leave. The uncharted territory map lay on the central table, its desolate landscape glowing faintly in the gloom. The tiny, hunched figure representing him was now perilously close to the monstrous, Thorncroft-like edifice at its heart. There was no more time. He took a deep breath, the air in the study thick and cold, smelling of ozone and old sorrow. He reached out and placed his hands flat on the surface of the map. He closed his eyes. "All right, Thorn," he whispered, his voice hoarse. "All right, you bloody maps. Show me." At first, nothing happened. Then, a dizzying vertigo seized him. The floor beneath his feet seemed to tilt and sway. The scent of dust and old paper intensified, then was rapidly replaced by a biting, sterile cold and the smell of damp earth and something else, something ancient and mineral. He felt a sensation of immense pressure, as if he were being squeezed through a narrow aperture. The sounds of the storm outside, the creaking house, faded, replaced by a profound, echoing silence, broken only by a distant, mournful wind that wasn't the Essex wind he knew. When he opened his eyes, the study was gone. He stood on a barren, rocky plain. The ground beneath his boots was a dark, volcanic scree that crunched with each hesitant step. Above him, the sky was a bruised, perpetual twilight, devoid of sun, moon, or stars, only a faint, sickly luminescence emanating from the jagged, light-sucking peaks that clawed at the horizon. The air was thin, bitingly cold, and carried the faint, metallic tang he'd sometimes smelled in the study. He looked around, his heart hammering against his ribs like a trapped bird. This was it. The uncharted territory. Thorne's final map, made real. Or perhaps, he had stepped inside the map, into its two-dimensional world given horrific, three-dimensional life. The landscape was exactly as depicted on the vellum. Desolate, alien, utterly devoid of warmth or life. In the distance, he could see the strange, geometric structures, like forgotten tombs, and the dark, obsidian gleam of the lake. And there, dominating the skyline, its twisted gables and narrow, lightless windows, a grotesque parody of Thorncroft, was the monstrous edifice from the map. It seemed to pulse with a dark, internal energy. He was alone. Utterly, terrifyingly alone. He fumbled for the compass. Its needle spun wildly, then settled, pointing not north, but directly towards the Thorncroft-like structure. A path, of sorts. He checked the flashlight. It cast a weak, nervous beam that seemed to be swallowed by the oppressive gloom. He took a tentative step, then another. The silence was unnerving, broken only by the crunch of his boots on the scree and the mournful sigh of the wind whistling through unseen crevices in the rock. He walked for what felt like hours, though time seemed to have no meaning in this place. The landscape was monotonous, unchanging in its desolation. He passed several of the strange, mausoleum-like structures. They were built of a black, basalt-like rock, their surfaces covered in faint, unreadable glyphs that seemed to writhe and shift if he stared at them too long. There was no sign of who had built them, or why. His grief for Sarah, which had been a constant, aching presence, felt different here. Sharper, yes, but also, externalized. As if the landscape itself was a manifestation of sorrow, a physical embodiment of loss. He felt his own regret mingling with a vaster, older sadness that seemed to seep from the very rocks. He thought of Thorne, wondering if the surveyor had walked these same desolate paths, carrying his own unbearable burden. Was Thorne still here somewhere, a prisoner of his own creation? Or had he found whatever release he sought? As he drew closer to the monstrous Thorncroft, the air grew colder, the sense of oppression more intense. He could now see details, the heavy, dark wooden door, bolted and barred from the inside, the windows like vacant eyes staring out onto the bleakness. This was the heart of the map, the heart of the sorrow. He knew, with a chilling certainty, that he had to enter. This was where his path, drawn by an unseen hand, had led him. He reached the foot of the structure, its dark stone radiating an unnatural cold. The great door loomed before him. There was no handle, no knocker. Just the impenetrable wood and the heavy iron bars. He had followed the map. He was here. Now what? Chapter 14, The Heart of Regret. As Alastair stood before the great, dark door of the manifested Thorncroft, a low groan echoed from within, the sound of immense pressure or ancient hinges reluctantly moving. Slowly, one of the heavy iron bars slid back with a screech of metal on metal. Then another. The door itself, without any visible intervention, began to creak inwards, opening a narrow, black abyss into the heart of the structure. An invitation. Or a trap. He hesitated for only a moment. He hadn't come this far to turn back, even if he could. Gripping Thorne's flashlight, its beam cutting a nervous swathe through the oppressive darkness, he stepped across the threshold. The interior was not a replica of Thorncroft's familiar layout. Instead, he found himself in a vast, cavernous space. Reminiscent of a cathedral nave, though one dedicated to despair rather than divinity. The walls were lined with what looked like endless shelves, but instead of books, they held maps. Thousands upon thousands of them, rolled, stacked, spread open, illuminated by the same faint, sickly luminescence as the twilight sky outside. These were not maps of earthly places. They were charts of sorrow, diagrams of loss, topographies of regret, rendered in stark lines and bleak colors. And in the center of this immense, circular chamber, hunched over a vast, sloping lectern upon which a single, enormous map was spread, stood a figure. Tall, gaunt, dressed in the dark, old-fashioned clothes Alastair had glimpsed in his peripheral vision. Elias Thorne. Or what remained of him. As Alastair approached, Thorne slowly turned. His face was pale, deeply lined, his eyes holding an eternity of sorrow, but also a flicker of weary recognition. He was translucent, his form shimmering slightly, as if he were woven from the very twilight of this desolate realm. So, Thorne's voice was a dry rustle, like old parchment. Another surveyor arrives. Drawn by the lines. Thorne. Alastair managed, his own voice barely a whisper. A part of me, the spectral figure confirmed, gesturing vaguely at himself. The part that remains tethered to the ink, to the sorrow. The rest is lost in the uncharted. What is this place? Alastair asked, gesturing at the impossible library of grief. This is the nexus, Thorne said, his gaze sweeping the chamber. The heart of regret. My regret, primarily. But it draws upon others. Yours, now. He looked at Alastair with those ancient, sorrowful eyes. Your wife. Sarah, was it? A terrible loss. Such lines are hard to bear. Alastair flinched at the casual, knowing mention of Sarah. You brought me here. The maps brought you. The house is an anchor, yes, but it is the grief within that truly powers the conduit. I merely refined the process. I sought to map my way back to Amelia and Lily, to find a path where they were not taken. Instead, I charted this. He gestured again to the desolate landscape visible through the open doorway. A prison of my own making. And now, it seems, of yours. The Surrey map, Alastair said, the pieces clicking into place. The Phantom Road. That was you? Trying to show me, what? Thorne nodded slowly. A possibility. A path not taken. In this place, all paths, all regrets, have a certain tangibility. I thought perhaps if you could see it, truly see it, you might understand the nature of these charts. Or perhaps, his voice grew fainter, I hoped you might find a way to alter them. Something I could never achieve. He turned back to the enormous map on the lectern. It was a vast, impossibly complex chart, filled with shifting lines, dark whirls, and fleeting images that flickered like dying embers, images of shipwrecks, car crashes, tear-stained faces, lost children. The sum of all sorrow. I tried to map my way out, Thorne continued, his voice laced with despair. To find a coordinate for peace. But every line I drew only bound me tighter. Every attempt to alter the past only reinforced its immutable tragedy. The ink of regret is indelible. Suddenly, the air in the chamber grew colder. The images on the great map swirled, and one coalesced with horrifying clarity, the intersection on the A317. Alastair saw it as if from above, the blind bend, the oncoming lorry, Sarah's small blue car approaching. Time seemed to slow. This is where your strongest line of regret is anchored, Thorne murmured, his spectral hand hovering over the image. The point of divergence. Alastair felt himself drawn towards it, his own sorrow a physical force pulling him in. He was there, beside the road, helpless, watching the inevitable unfold. He could smell the diesel, hear the screech of tires that hadn't happened yet. Can it be changed? Alistair whispered, the desperate hope he tried to crush flaring anew. Thorn's spectral form seemed to waver. I do not know. I only know that to attempt it is to risk being consumed by it, to become another lost coordinate in this desolate atlas. He looked at Alistair, a flicker of something akin to pity in his ancient eyes. The maps demand a surveyor. They feed on the desire to correct, to reroute. But they offer no true solace, only an echo chamber of what might have been. The image of the crash flickered, and for a moment, Alistair saw the detour Thorn had drawn on the Surrey map, a clear, safe path. But then it dissolved, the original, fatal trajectory reasserting itself. This place, this house, this power, Alistair said, his voice trembling. What is its source? Thorn gestured vaguely towards the shifting lines on the great map. Sorrow itself. Ancient griefs embedded in the land, perhaps. My own amplified it, gave it form. Thorncroft, built on a place of old sadness, became the lens. The maps are merely the language it learned to speak. He paused. It seeks to understand itself, to chart its own endlessness. And it needs a conscious mind, a surveyor, to do so. Alistair understood then. This wasn't just Thorn's prison. It was a sentient, sorrowful geography, and Thorn was its first cartographer, its first prisoner. And it was grooming Alistair to be the next. Chapter 15, Redrawing the Lines. The image of Sarah's impending crash hung before Alistair, suspended within the vast, sorrowful map at the heart of the manifested Thorncroft. The urge to reach out, to somehow intervene, to shout a warning across the impossible divide, was overwhelming. If I try to change it, Alistair began, his voice raw. You risk unraveling yourself, Thorn's spectral form whispered, his gaze fixed on the unfolding tragedy. The lines of what was are strong. To fight them is to invite chaos. But Alistair, looking at the scene, at Sarah's blue car moments from impact, felt a surge of defiance, not just against this desolate place, but against the tyranny of immutable regret. He was an urban planner. He dealt in lines, in routes, in finding better ways. There has to be another way, he insisted, more to himself than to Thorn. He thought of his own work, of rerouting traffic, of designing diversions, of finding solutions where none seemed to exist. This was a problem of catastrophic design, a flaw in the flow of fate. He looked at Thorn. You tried to map your way back to your family. You tried to change your past. But what if the goal isn't to change the past, but to recontextualize it? To build a new path forward, away from the nexus of regret? Thorn's translucent form flickered. A new path? Here. All paths here lead back to sorrow. Not if we redraw the primary lines, Alistair said, a desperate idea forming. He remembered Thorn's journal, the mention of the house as an anchor. This entire desolate realm, this manifested Thorncroft, was an extension of that anchor, powered by grief. He focused on the image of the crash. He couldn't stop it. He knew that with a deep, bone-aching certainty. The ink of that event was too deeply set, too potent. But perhaps he could alter how it connected to this place, to him. He closed his eyes, not looking at the visual representation, but feeling the emotional weight of it, the raw, jagged edge of his grief. He thought of Sarah, not just her death, but her life, their shared joys, the love that had defined them. He focused on that love, a pinprick of warmth in the overwhelming cold of the chamber. Then, using not a pen, but the sheer force of his will, his focused intention, he began to mentally draw. He visualized a new line, not one that erased the tragedy, but one that bypassed this chamber of despair. A line that led from his memory of Sarah, not into the abyss of regret, but towards acceptance, towards a future where her memory was a comfort, not a continuous wound. He wasn't trying to change the event, but to change its destination on his internal map. It was agonizing. The forces of this place resisted, the weight of sorrow pressing down on him, Thorn's desolate whispers urging him to give up, to accept the inevitable. He felt the cold of the uncharted territory seeping into his bones, the temptation to surrender to the bleakness almost overwhelming. But he held on, focusing on Sarah's laugh, the warmth of her hand in his. He poured all his love, all his pain, all his desperate hope for peace into this invisible, mental line. Slowly, agonizingly, something began to shift. The image of the crash on the great map didn't vanish, but it seemed to dim. To lose some of its terrible, immediate power. The oppressive atmosphere in the chamber lightened, almost imperceptibly. Thorn gasped, a sound like wind through a broken window. What are you doing?" "Rezoning," Alastair muttered, the term from his old life's strangely apartment, creating a new master plan. He wasn't destroying the sorrow, but he was attempting to contain it, to build a bypass around its most destructive manifestations. He imagined the anchor in Thorncroft, not being severed, but being insulated. Shielded. Its power to draw in and amplify grief being dampened. The great map on the lectern began to flicker violently. Lines dissolved and reformed. The desolate landscape outside the open doorway seemed to waver, its edges blurring. Thorn's spectral form grew fainter, more transparent. "The lines, they are changing," he whispered, a note of awe, perhaps even hope, in his voice. "The uncharted territory, it recedes." Alastair pushed harder, pouring every ounce of his being into this act of psychic cartography. He felt a tearing sensation, as if something deep within him was being reconfigured. It was the most difficult thing he had ever done. Then, with a final, wrenching effort, he felt something give. A sense of release, of immense pressure lifting. The oppressive cold in the chamber lessened. The vast map on the lectern began to fade, its multitude of sorrows dimming like dying stars. Elias Thorn's form was now barely visible, a shimmering outline. He looked at Alastair, and for the first time, there was a faint, almost imperceptible smile on his spectral lips. You found a different way, to chart the sorrow," his voice was a fading echo. "Thank you." And then, he was gone. Dissolved into the lightning gloom. The monstrous Thorncroft around Alastair began to tremble. The walls shimmered, the shelves of sorrowful maps receding into mist. The desolate landscape visible through the doorway was dissolving, replaced by swirling grey fog. Alastair felt a powerful pull, as if he were being drawn backwards. He stumbled, disoriented. The pressure, the cold, the alien smells, all were fading. He closed his eyes, and when he opened them again, he was standing in the study at Thorncroft in Oakhaven. The storm outside had passed. Weak morning light filtered through the grimy window. He was panting, his clothes damp with sweat, his body aching as if he'd run a marathon. On the central table, the uncharted territory map lay blank. The vellum was pristine, empty. The Surrey map, nearby, still showed its phantom road, but it looked ordinary. Just lines on paper. The oppressive atmosphere of the room was gone. It was just an old study, filled with old maps. He felt different. Exhausted, hollowed out, but also lighter. The crushing weight of his grief for Sarah was still there, a part of him, but it no longer defined him. It was a scar, not an open wound. He had walked into the heart of his regret and, somehow, found a path through it. Over the next few days, Alastair cautiously tested the house. The cold spots were gone. The feeling of being watched had vanished. The surveying equipment remained still. The maps were just maps, old paper, old ink. He even picked up Thorn's fountain pen, it was just an antique pen. He found Thorn's journal. Its pages were now blank. He didn't know if he had truly changed anything in some grand cosmic sense, or if he had merely redrawn the lines of his own internal landscape. Perhaps both. He had not brought Sarah back, nor erased the tragedy. But he had faced it. And in doing so, had perhaps brought a measure of peace to Elias Thorn's tormented spirit, and, more importantly, to his own. Alastair stayed in Oakhaven. He didn't sell Thorncroft. He cleaned the house, aired out the rooms, even started to tentatively plan the garden. The maps remained in the study, a vast, silent collection. He would sometimes go in, look at them, appreciate their artistry, their history. They no longer held any terror for him, only a quiet melancholy, a reminder of the paths taken and untaken, by him, by Thorn, by countless others. He knew he would never forget his journey into the uncharted territory, his time as the cartographer of regret. But he was no longer a prisoner of those lines. He had found a way to draw his own map forward, one that acknowledged the sorrow, but was no longer defined by it. The future was still an unknown territory, but now, it felt less like a threat, and more like an open possibility. And Alastair Finch, the urban planner, was finally ready to start surveying it. Chapter 1, The Retreat. Alastair Finch, novelist, formerly, stared at the rejection slip, its crisp, corporate indifference a fresh layer of salt in a wound already festering. His latest novel, The Obsidian Mirror, had not just been panned, it had been gleefully dismembered by critics, each review a public autopsy of his talent. A turgid exercise in navel-gazing, declared the Literary Chronicle. Finch has lost his way, assuming he ever had one, sneered the New Clarion. His publisher, Henderson and Croft, who had once lauded him as the voice of a generation, had swiftly followed suit, their termination letter polite but chillingly final. Market realities, it had said. Alastair translated, "You're a failure, and you're no longer profitable." He was 42. His career, once a sputtering flame of promise, was now a pile of cold ash. His marriage had crumbled under the weight of his obsessive writing and subsequent failures years ago. Friends, those fair-weather companions of modest success, had evaporated like morning dew. All that remained was a hollow echo in his chest and the bitter taste of unfulfilled potential. He needed to escape. Not just the city, with its constant reminders of his disgrace, but himself, if such a thing were possible. An obscure classified ad led him to it, a small, stone cottage for long-term let, nestled deep within the Umbra Valley. The name itself resonated with his mood, a place of shadows, of dim, forgotten things. The agent, a brisk woman named Mrs. Gable, had described it as charmingly rustic and perfect for those seeking solitude. The photographs showed a squat, gray building almost swallowed by an overgrown garden, with mist-shrouded hills looming behind. It was perfect. The Umbra Valley, he soon discovered, lived up to its name. It was a deep cleft in the western uplands, perpetually draped in a soft, pearlescent mist that rarely burned off entirely, even at midday. The sun, when it appeared, was a diffused, melancholy glow. Silence was the valley's currency, broken only by the sigh of the wind through ancient pines, the occasional cry of a distant hawk, or the mournful burble of the river Styx, a black ribbon of water that coiled through the valley floor. The locals, few and far between, were as taciturn and weathered as the landscape. The cottage stood at the valley's deepest point, a good mile from the nearest sleepy hamlet of Oakhaven. It was older than Mrs. Gable had let on, its stones slick with moss, its windows small and deep-set like suspicious eyes. Inside, it smelled of damp earth, wood smoke, and something else, a faint, papery scent, like a forgotten library. The furniture was sparse, heavy, and dark. Dust lay thick on every surface, a testament to the previous occupants' reclusive nature, or perhaps, their sudden departure. Mrs. Gable had mentioned the former tenant, a Mr. Silas Blackwood, had passed on, her tone implying circumstances best left unprobed. Alastair unpacked his meager belongings, clothes, a handful of books he couldn't bear to part with, none of them his own, and his laptop, its screen a mocking black mirror reflecting his own gaunt face. He had no intention of writing. The wellspring of his creativity had run dry, leaving behind a barren, cracked riverbed. He was here to disappear, to let the silence and the mist swallow him whole. Perhaps, he thought with a grim sense of irony, he could finally write his masterpiece, the definitive study of absolute, unadulterated failure. But even that felt like too much effort. The first few days passed in a blur of unpacking, aimless wandering through the damp garden, and staring out at the shifting veils of mist. The silence, initially a balm, began to acquire a weight, a presence. It pressed against his eardrums, filled the spaces between his thoughts. He ate little, slept fitfully, haunted by the ghosts of scathing reviews and the accusing stares of characters he had failed to bring convincingly to life. He was a writer with nothing left to say, a storyteller whose narratives had all unraveled. The Umbra Valley, it seemed, was the perfect mausoleum for a dead career. Chapter 2, The Legacy of Maps. A week into his self-imposed exile, driven by a restless boredom that even the oppressive atmosphere couldn't entirely quell, Alastair began to explore the cottage more thoroughly. The ground floor was simple enough, a kitchen, a living area dominated by a cavernous hearth, and a small, damp scullery. Upstairs, 2 bedrooms and a tiny, antiquated bathroom. It was the attic, however, that drew him. The access was a flimsy fold-down ladder in the hallway ceiling, coated in a cobweb tapestry that suggested years of neglect. Armed with a sputtering oil lamp he'd found in the scullery, he ascended into the low-beamed space. Dust motes danced in the lamp's flickering glow, thick as summer insects. The air was heavy, stale, imbued with that same peculiar, dry paper scent he'd noticed downstairs, only stronger here. The attic was crammed with the detritus of a forgotten life, broken furniture, cobweb-shrouded trunks, stacks of yellowed newspapers. And in the furthest, darkest corner, half hidden beneath a moth-eaten tarpaulin, was a large, brass-bound wooden chest. It was locked. Of course it was. But the lock was old, simple. A few minutes of patient probing with a bent nail from a loose floorboard, and the mechanism gave with a rusty click. Alastair lifted the heavy lid, a puff of dust and the scent of old parchment billowing out. Inside, nestled on faded velvet, lay an extraordinary collection of maps. They were not ordinary geographical charts. These were hand-drawn, meticulously rendered on thick, creamy paper that crackled like autumn leaves. The calligraphy was elegant, archaic. Some depicted the local Umbra Valley area, but with an unsettlingly dreamlike quality. Others seemed to chart entirely fantastical landscapes. What truly caught his eye, however, were the names inscribed upon them, written in a spidery, meticulous hand. The whispering woods of unspoken dialogue. The barrens of the second act slump. Mount Indecision. The quagmire of exposition. The labyrinth of plot holes. The precipice of the climax. Alastair felt a strange prickle on his skin. These were not places, they were metaphors, writerly anxieties given cartographic form. He pulled out a particularly large map, its edges brittle. It showed a winding, treacherous path labeled, the trail of abandoned drafts, snaking through a desolate landscape of half-formed structures and faded inkblots representing forgotten ideas. Tiny, almost microscopic notes in the margins read, "Here lies the hero of The Crimson Shard, motivation unclear," or "The Village of Oakhaven," before the plot diverged fatally. Beneath the maps, he found a collection of antique surveying equipment, a tarnished brass theodolite, its lenses cloudy, a heavy gunter's chain, its links cold and smooth, several compasses with ornate, fleur-de-lis pointers, and a set of drafting tools, pens, rulers, protractors, all exquisitely made, all bearing the patina of age and use. He spent hours in the dim, flickering light of the lamp, carefully unrolling each map, his writer's mind, dormant for so long, stirring with a reluctant curiosity. Who was Silas Blackwood? Clearly, not just some rustic recluse. These maps were the work of an obsessive, perhaps even unhinged, imagination. Had Blackwood been a writer too? A cartographer of his own creative torments? The names were chillingly familiar, resonating with his own experiences of the agonizing, often futile, process of creation. The ravine of silence, he knew that place intimately, had been lost in its depths for months. The bog of endless revisions. The chasm of self-doubt. It was as if Blackwood had mapped the very geography of a writer's soul. As dusk began to bleed through the single grimy attic window, painting the rafters in shades of bruised purple. Alastair carefully rolled the maps and returned them to the chest, along with the surveying tools. He felt a strange disquiet, a sense of having stumbled upon something deeply personal, perhaps even forbidden. The silence of the cottage suddenly seemed less empty, charged with an unspoken narrative. He descended the ladder, leaving the attic to its secrets, but the images of those surreal, allegorical landscapes, and the unnervingly perceptive names, followed him down into the growing gloom. That night, for the first time since his arrival, Alastair Finch did not dream of failure. He dreamt of ink, and paper, and the meticulous tracing of impossible paths. Chapter 3, First Stirrings. Alastair tried to dismiss the maps as the eccentric hobby of a troubled mind. Silas Blackwood had clearly been wrestling with his own demons, choosing to externalize them onto paper. An odd coping mechanism, certainly, but nothing more. He had his own, more conventional failures to dwell on. He attempted to write. He opened his laptop, stared at the blank document, the cursor blinking with maddening patience. Words, once his allies, his tools, his very breath, now felt alien, cumbersome. The silence of the Umbra Valley, which he had initially sought as a refuge, now seemed to amplify his inadequacy. It was a vast, empty page he couldn't fill. He'd type a sentence, delete it. A paragraph, and then consign it to digital oblivion. The ravine of silence, he thought, with a grim, internal nod to Blackwood's cartography. He was well and truly lost in it. The days grew shorter, the mist thicker, often not receding from the cottage walls until late afternoon. He took long, aimless walks, the damp air clinging to his clothes, the silence broken only by the squelch of his boots on muddy trails. The valley felt like a place outside of time, a forgotten fold in the fabric of the world. It was during one of these aimless evenings, huddled by the meager warmth of the fire, nursing a glass of cheap whiskey, that he found himself drawn back to the attic. He told himself it was merely to retrieve a warmer blanket from one of the trunks. But he knew, with a sense of uneasy compulsion, that it was the maps he sought. He unrolled the trail of abandoned drafts again, spreading it on the dusty floor. The lamplight cast flickering shadows across its surface. He traced the main path with a hesitant finger, past landmarks like the chapter that wrote itself into a corner, and the unconvincing love interest's cottage. His gaze fell upon a section he hadn't paid much attention to before, a faint, barely discernible spur leading off into a region marked ideas too frightening to pursue. He frowned. He didn't remember that particular spur being quite so defined. It seemed a shade darker, the ink a fraction fresher, than the surrounding lines. He held the lamp closer. Was it his imagination, a trick of the wavering light and the potent whiskey? Probably. He'd been cooped up too long, his mind starting to play tricks. He rolled up the map, a sudden chill crawling up his spine that had nothing to do with the attic's ambient temperature. He told himself it was the subject matter, the map's uncanny reflection of his own creative graveyard. Yet, a sliver of doubt, sharp as a paper cut, lodged itself in his mind. The next morning, after a restless night filled with dreams of shifting ink and whispering paper, he went back to the attic. He needed to prove to himself that it was just a figment of his overactive, understimulated imagination. He unrolled the trail of abandoned drafts in the thin morning light that filtered through the grimy window. The spur path was still there. And it was, undeniably, more distinct than he remembered. It wasn't a dramatic change, nothing that would scream of the uncanny, but it was there, a subtle thickening of the line, a nuance of shade that suggested fresh application. As if someone, or something, had been delicately retouching it in the night. Alastair stared at it, his heart thumping a slow, heavy beat against his ribs. He ran a finger over the line. It felt no different from the rest of the map, the paper smooth and dry. He told himself he was stressed, isolated, his perception skewed. He was a writer, after all, his stock in trade was imagination, and right now, his imagination was perhaps working overtime in the absence of any real creative outlet. He meticulously examined other maps. The whispering woods of unspoken dialogue seemed to have a new, tiny clearing marked near its heart. On Mount Indecision, a series of contour lines near the summit looked subtly altered, suggesting a steeper, more treacherous ascent. He dismissed it. He had to. The alternative was too unsettling to contemplate. He was simply projecting his own anxieties onto these inert objects. He rolled up the maps, locked the chest with more force than necessary, and practically fled the attic, the dry, papery scent clinging to him like a shroud. But the image of that subtly changing line, the fresh breath of ink on ancient paper, remained, a tiny, insistent question mark in the oppressive silence of his retreat. Chapter 4, The Scent of Ink. The disquiet lingered, an unwelcome guest in Alistair's already troubled mind. He tried to avoid the attic, focusing instead on the mundane routines of survival, chopping wood for the inefficient fireplace, attempting to cook edible meals on the ancient stove, taking long, solitary walks deeper into the mist-choked valley. But the maps, and the subtle, almost imperceptible changes he thought he'd witnessed, tugged at the edges of his thoughts. He found himself increasingly sensitive to the cottage's atmosphere. The scent of old paper and dry ink seemed to permeate the very walls, sometimes catching him unawares, a sudden, stronger whiff as he passed the hallway where the attic ladder was situated, or when a draft eddied through the ill-fitting window frames. It was the smell of Blackwood's obsession, he told himself, soaked into the fabric of the house over years. Then came other, more specific phantom scents. One afternoon, while staring blankly at his laptop screen, he was suddenly enveloped by the distinct aroma of lavender and old lace. It was faint, elusive, but unmistakable. His mind, sluggish for so long, churned. Lavender and old lace, a minor character, a spectral grandmother figure, in his second novel, The House of Echoing Rooms, a novel praised for its atmosphere but criticized for its languid pace. He hadn't thought of her in years. The scent lingered for a moment, then vanished, leaving him bewildered and unnerved. A few days later, while trying to read, he smelled the acrid, metallic tang of stage blood, mingled with the dustiness of velvet curtains. This evoked a scene from a play he'd started writing in his university days, a lurid melodrama he'd abandoned after the first act. The memory was so vivid, so specific, it was as if the play were being performed in the next room. These olfactory hallucinations, if that's what they were always linked to his past works, specifically the unfinished, the abandoned, the failed. It was as if the house itself were curating a museum of his literary disappointments. The temperature in the cottage also seemed to fluctuate unpredictably, especially near the hallway leading to the attic. Cold spots would materialize, raising gooseflesh on his arms, then dissipate as quickly as they arrived. He'd blame drafts, the ancient stone construction, anything but the growing unease that coiled in his stomach. One evening, driven by a morbid curiosity he couldn't suppress, he returned to the attic. He needed to see the maps again, to confirm or deny the unsettling notion that they were not static. He unrolled The Barrens of the Second Act Slump, a particularly bleak chart depicting a vast, featureless desert. He remembered a specific detail, a tiny, almost invisible representation of a dried-up well in one corner, labeled The Well of Exhausted Tropes. He found it. And the ink depicting the well seemed fresher. Darker. Almost damp. He leaned closer, his breath catching in his throat. He could have sworn, for the briefest of moments, he smelled the faint, dank odor of stagnant water. He recoiled, scrambling back from the map, his heart hammering. This was impossible. It was his mind, starved of stimulus, grieving his career, manufacturing these experiences. He was a failed writer descending into madness in a misty, isolated valley. It was a perfectly plausible, if tragic, narrative. He forced himself to be rational. He examined the ink again. It was dry to the touch. The smell of stagnant water was gone, replaced by the usual attic sense of dust and decay. Trick of the light. Olfactory memory. Suggestion. But the feeling of unease was now a palpable presence. The maps were no longer just curious artifacts, they felt active, watchful. The silence of the cottage was no longer just an absence of sound, but a listening silence. That night, sleep offered no escape. He dreamt he was trapped within one of Blackwood's maps, the landscape shifting around him, ink bleeding like wounds in the paper earth, while a faint scratching sound, like a pen on parchment, echoed from just beyond his sight. He woke in a cold sweat, the scent of fresh ink sharp in his nostrils, even though the maps were locked away in the attic chest, 2 floors above his cold, lonely bed. The writer with nothing left was beginning to suspect that something, or someone, was trying to write him. Part 2, The Cartography of Uncreation. Chapter 5, The Ravine of Silence. Alastair found himself drawn to one map in particular, the Ravine of Silence. It depicted a deep, shadowed chasm, its sides sheer and featureless, snaking through an otherwise blank landscape. There were no paths leading in or out, no landmarks, just the stark, oppressive representation of emptiness. The name itself was a punch to his gut, a perfect encapsulation of his current creative state. He began to spend more time with this map than any other, unrolling it on the living room floor, staring at its stark contours for hours. The ink that delineated the ravine seemed to possess a unique depth, a blackness that felt almost absolute. And as the days passed, as his own inability to write became a more profound and suffocating presence, he noticed changes. The ravine on the map appeared to be deepening. Not in a physical, three-dimensional sense, but the shading grew more intense, the lines defining its edges sharper, more incised. It was subtle, the kind of alteration one might doubt, attribute to shifting light or wishful thinking. But Alastair, his senses now preternaturally attuned to the nuances of Blackwood's cartography, knew it was real. The map was responding to him, or perhaps, he was responding to it. His attempts to write became exercises in exquisite torture. He would sit at his laptop, fingers poised over the keyboard, and a leaden weight would settle in his mind. Thoughts, once fluid and eager, became treacly, then solidified entirely. The blank page seemed to mock him, its whiteness an accusation. The silence of the cottage would press in, no longer just an absence of sound but an active, muffling force. It felt as if the very air in the room was thickening, making it difficult to breathe, let alone conjure words. He'd look at the map of the ravine, spread out beside his desk. Its stark depiction of emptiness felt like a mirror. He found himself tracing the edges of the chasm with his finger, feeling a strange, almost vertiginous pull, as if he could fall into the inky blackness. One afternoon, as a particularly dense bank of mist rolled down from the hills, enveloping the cottage in a silent, grey embrace, Alastair was trying, with grim determination, to outline a new story idea, a pathetic, flickering ember of a notion he knew would likely die before it caught. As he struggled to find the right words, to shape a coherent thought, he glanced at the map. The ink depicting the ravine of silence was visibly darker, almost glistening. The lines seemed to pulse faintly in the dim light. And as he stared, a profound wave of mental inertia washed over him. It wasn't just writer's block, it was a complete shutdown, a neurological dead end. His thoughts scattered like frightened birds, leaving behind an echoing void. He couldn't form a sentence, couldn't even grasp the thread of the idea he'd been pursuing. It was as if a switch had been flipped in his brain, plunging his creative faculties into darkness. The sensation was terrifyingly physical. A pressure built behind his eyes, his throat tightened. He gasped, pushing back from the desk, his gaze fixed on the map. The ravine seemed to yawn before him, an abyss of utter conceptual emptiness. He stumbled away, snatching up the map and hastily rolling it, his hands trembling. He thrust it back into the chest in the attic, slamming the lid shut. The oppressive mental fog lifted slightly, but a residue of dread remained. The Ravine of Silence. It wasn't just a name on a piece of paper. It was a place, a state, and it seemed to be growing, feeding on his despair, its cartographic representation a direct conduit to the barren landscape of his own mind. The maps were no longer passive objects of curiosity. They were active agents, and their influence was becoming alarmingly personal. Chapter 6, Echoes from the Page. The bleed-through, as Alastair had started to reluctantly call it in his mind, was no longer confined to phantom scents or fleeting cold spots. It began to manifest in more concrete, though still ephemeral, ways. The barrier between the mapped world of his abandoned creations and the physical reality of the cottage was becoming porous. One morning, he was brewing tea in the kitchen, the mist outside pressing against the windowpane like a ghostly hand. He heard it distinctly, a woman's voice, soft and melancholic, humming a lullaby. It was faint, as if coming from a great distance, yet undeniably present within the confines of the small kitchen. His blood ran cold. The lullaby, he recognized it. It was from The Clockwork Nightingale, a steampunk novella he'd toiled over for a year before abandoning it, deeming the plot too convoluted, the characters too thin. The protagonist's mother, a shadowy figure, used to hum that specific, self-composed tune. He spun around, his heart hammering. The kitchen was empty. The humming faded, leaving only the drip of the tap and the sigh of the wind. He checked the rest of the cottage, his breath held tight in his chest. Nothing. No one. Later that day, while sitting by the fire, staring into the flames, he saw a flash of movement from the corner of his eye. He turned. On the small, rickety table beside his armchair, where moments before there had been nothing but a dusty coaster, sat a single, tarnished silver button, intricately carved with the image of a coiled serpent. Alistair stared at it, his mind racing. The serpent button. It was a distinct, memorable detail from a character in The Serpent's Tooth, a historical thriller he'd almost finished before a crisis of confidence had led him to shelve it indefinitely. The antagonist, a Machiavellian courtier, had worn a waistcoat fastened with such buttons. He reached out a trembling hand. As his fingers brushed against the cool metal, the button flickered, like a faulty projection, and vanished. He was left staring at the empty, dusty surface of the table, the imprint of its brief existence seared into his mind. These manifestations were always brief, always tied to his unfinished work. A child's wooden toy, described in a discarded short story, appeared for a moment on the mantelpiece. The scent of rain on hot asphalt, a key sensory detail from the opening scene of his disastrously reviewed Obsidian Mirror, filled the living room for a few seconds before dissipating. He even heard, once, the distinct click-clack of a manual typewriter, the kind his first literary hero, a grizzled, hard-boiled detective in an early, embarrassingly derivative manuscript, had used. He started to document these occurrences in a small notebook, his entries stark, factual, almost clinical, as if by recording them he could somehow assert control, or at least prove his own sanity. Or perhaps, prove his descent into it. October 17th, heard 3 distinct notes played on a harpsichord. From The Crimson Mask, unfinished opera libretto, circa 2005. Lasted approximate 5 seconds. October 19th, clear scent of brine and tarred rope in the bedroom. Recalled a seafaring adventure story, The Salt-Stained Chart, abandoned after Chapter 2. Present for nearly a minute. October 22nd, saw a small, ivory chess piece, a pawn, on the windowsill. Matched description from The Endgame Variation, psychological thriller, Draft 1, deleted. Vanished upon approach. The cottage was becoming a theater of his literary ghosts, each ephemeral manifestation a reminder of a path not taken, a story untold, a potential unfulfilled. The maps, he knew, were the source. They were not just charting his failures, they were exhuming them, giving them fleeting, tantalizing form. The previous owner, Silas Blackwood, hadn't just been mapping his own creative landscape, he'd found a way to make it bleed into reality. And now, Alistair was caught in the same surreal, unsettling current. Chapter 7, The Watcher in the Mist. The feeling of being watched, once a vague unease, solidified into a near-constant certainty. It was most acute when he was near the maps, or when the mist pressed particularly close to the cottage, rendering the outside world an amorphous gray blur. He would feel a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, the undeniable sense of unseen eyes fixed upon him. He'd whirl around, expecting to find someone, something, standing in the shadows of the dimly lit rooms. There was never anything but the familiar, dusty furniture, the play of weak light and deep shadow. Yet, the feeling persisted, a silent, invisible observer sharing his solitude. The sounds began to subtly change. The normal creaks and groans of an old house settling were now punctuated by other, more specific noises. A faint, dry rustle, like old paper being turned, would emanate from the direction of the attic, even when he knew the chest was locked. The distinct scratch of a pen nib on parchment, quick and furtive, would sometimes drift down the stairs. He'd call out, his voice sounding unnaturally loud in the oppressive quiet. Only silence would answer. The antique surveying equipment, which he had left in the chest with the maps, began to exhibit its own unsettling behavior. One morning, he went to the attic, steeling himself for another look at the maps. He found the lid of the chest slightly ajar, though he was certain he'd locked it. Inside, the heavy brass theodolite, which he had carefully laid flat, was now angled slightly, its eyepiece pointing directly at the rolled-up map of the Trail of Abandoned Drafts. A chill traced its way down Alistair's spine. He repositioned it, locked the chest, and tested the latch. Secure. A few days later, one of the ornate compasses, which he had taken out and placed on his desk as a morbid paperweight, was no longer pointing north. Its needle was rigidly aimed towards the hallway, towards the attic stairs. He picked it up. The brass was inexplicably cold to the touch, a deep, penetrating chill that made his fingers ache. He nudged the needle, it swung reluctantly back to north, then, as if drawn by an invisible magnet, slowly but surely realigned itself towards the attic. Shadows in the room where he kept the maps when he dared to study them, usually the living room, for its slightly better light, seemed to possess an independent life. They would lengthen unnaturally, stretch and writhe in the corners of his vision, always retracting when he looked directly at them. He started to light more lamps, burning through his meager supply of oil, but the oppressive gloom seemed to cling to the corners of the cottage, a darkness that light could not fully dispel. He was sleeping less and less, his nerves frayed. Every creak of a floorboard, every sigh of the wind, every rustle of leaves outside his window, sounded like an approaching footstep, the prelude to a revelation he wasn't sure he could bear. He began talking to himself, his whispers a frail defense against the encroaching silence and the sense of the unseen. "Who's there, Blackwood?" he'd murmur, staring into the darkest corners. "Is this your doing? What do you want?" Only the mist-laden silence of the Umbra Valley answered, and the persistent, unnerving feeling that his every move, his every thought, was being meticulously observed, perhaps even charted. The writer, already isolated by his failure, was now becoming a prisoner in a house that watched him with the cold, dispassionate focus of a surveyor cataloging a new, and unsettling, terrain. Chapter 8, Compulsion and Resistance. A strange duality began to war within Alistair. Part of him was terrified by the escalating phenomena, by the creeping realization that the maps possessed a power far beyond mere symbolic representation. This part urged him to flee the cottage, the valley, this nexus of creative despair and uncanny influence. But another, more insidious part felt a growing compulsion, a perverse curiosity that bordered on obsession. He found himself drawn to the maps, not just to observe their changes, but to interact with them. He felt an urge to take one of Blackwood's drafting pens and correct a path on the labyrinth of plot holes, to add a bridge over the chasm of self-doubt, or even to trace the newly appeared, unsettling routes with his own finger, as if to understand their destination. When he tried to resist this pull, to ignore the maps and focus on escape or simple survival, the phenomena intensified. The cottage itself seemed to conspire against him. Doors would creak open on their own, or refuse to latch. The mist would seep under the doorsills, bringing with it the cloying scent of old ink and damp paper. The phantom sounds, the scratching pen, the rustling parchment, grew louder, more insistent. One evening, he made a determined effort to pack a small bag, resolving to walk to Oakhaven at first light and find transport out of the valley. As he gathered his few belongings, a map he'd left unrolled on the table, the valley of fading inspirations, began to ripple, as if a breeze were passing over it, though the air in the room was still. He watched, frozen, as a new, faint red line began to draw itself across the parchment, originating from the small icon representing his cottage and heading directly towards a feature labeled, "The Point of No Return." Panic flared. He snatched up the map, intending to tear it, burn it. But as his fingers touched the paper, a wave of intense nausea and dizziness swept over him. The room tilted, the lamplight flared, and he heard a chorus of faint, overlapping whispers, snippets of dialogue from his abandoned stories, lines of his own forgotten prose. He stumbled back, dropping the map. The red line continued its slow, inexorable crawl. Another map, one depicting the immediate surroundings of the cottage with unsettling accuracy, began to actively track his movements. If he moved from the living room to the kitchen, a tiny, pinprick of light, like a surveyor's mark, would appear on the map in the corresponding location. He tested it, moving back and forth, watching in horrified fascination as the light point mirrored his every step. It was as if the house itself was reporting his position to an unseen cartographer. This map even began to foreshadow small, mundane events. A faint symbol of a spilled cup would appear on the kitchen area of the map moments before he clumsily knocked over his mug of tea. A tiny, almost invisible sketch of a dead mouse would manifest near the scullery door an hour before he found one in a trap he'd forgotten he'd set. These were trivialities, yet their unerring accuracy was profoundly unnerving. The maps weren't just reflecting his past or his emotional state, they were demonstrating a disturbing prescience about his immediate present. The compulsion to engage, to understand, warred with his instinct for self-preservation. He was a writer, his nature was to explore narratives, to delve into mysteries. And this was the ultimate, terrifying mystery. Was Blackwood trying to guide him? Trap him? Or was this something else entirely, an impersonal force that the maps channeled? He found himself spending hours with the maps, no longer just a fearful observer, but an almost reluctant participant. He'd trace the paths, whisper questions to the silent parchment, half expecting an answer to appear in fresh ink. The writer with nothing left was becoming ensnared by a story not of his own making, a narrative written on ancient paper, whose author was long dead, yet whose presence felt more real, more potent, than anything in Alastair's own unraveling life. Chapter 9, The Topography of Failure. The personalization of the maps took a new, more brutal turn. One morning, Alastair found a new chart laid out on the chest in the attic, not rolled, but spread flat as if presented for his specific attention. He hadn't left it there. Its paper was newer than the others, less brittle, yet the style of cartography was unmistakably Blackwood's. The title, inked in stark, unforgiving calligraphy, read, Alastair Finch, A Topography of Wasted Potential. His breath hitched. This was no allegorical landscape of general writerly anxieties. This was him. The map depicted a bleak, desolate terrain. Towering over it all was the peak of inflated expectation, its summit perpetually shrouded in cloud. Leading down from it was the scree slope of early promise, littered with tiny symbols representing his first, moderately successful novel and the subsequent, smaller advances. This slope descended into the plateau of complacency, a flat, featureless expanse, before crumbling into the canyon of critical disdain, its walls etched with distorted, barely legible snippets of the worst reviews for The Obsidian Mirror. Beyond this, the landscape became even more harrowing. The swamp of self-doubt oozed with inky blackness, small, desperate notes in the margins reading, "Is this any good? Why bother? They'll hate it." Further on lay the dead end of critical acclaim, a stark cul-de-sac. A vast, arid desert was labeled the Great Barrens of unwritten masterpieces. Scattered throughout were smaller, equally painful landmarks, the puddle of plagiarism fears, the thicket of unresolved subplots, the mire of procrastination. It was a meticulous, cruel dissection of his entire professional life, his deepest insecurities laid bare and charted with chilling accuracy. Even the style of the ink seemed to mock him, the lines sharp and judgmental. He felt a surge of anger, then a profound, hollow despair. Who was doing this? Was it Blackwood's lingering spirit, somehow gleaning this information from Alastair's own tormented mind? Or was Alistair himself subconsciously guiding the pen, his own guilt and regret manifesting onto the page? The line between external force and internal projection was becoming impossibly blurred. He tried to destroy it. He snatched up the map, his hands shaking with a mixture of rage and fear, and crumpled it into a ball. As he did so, a sharp pain shot through his head, as if a spike were being driven into his skull. The room swam. He heard a cacophony of voices, his agent's disappointed tone, the sneering laughter of critics, his own whispered self-recriminations. He cried out, dropping the crumpled map. When his vision cleared, the map lay on the floor, smoothing itself out, the creases vanishing as if they had never been. The pain in his head subsided, leaving a dull ache. The message was clear: the maps could not be easily dismissed or destroyed. They demanded his attention, his acknowledgement. He picked it up, his anger replaced by a weary resignation. He spread it out on his desk downstairs, forcing himself to study its cruel contours. It was an act of masochistic self-flagellation, yet he couldn't look away. The map seemed to exert a gravitational pull, drawing his gaze, forcing him to confront the cartography of his own ruin. The topography of wasted potential became his constant companion. A silent, ever-present accuser. Sometimes, he would find new, minute details added to it. A tiny icon of a snapped pencil appearing near the field of creative block. A new, meandering path labeled the detour of feeble excuses. He was no longer just a failed writer retreating from the world, he was a subject, pinned and dissected on a cartographer's table, his life's failures transformed into a landscape of despair. The house, the mist, the maps, they were all part of a process, an elaborate, terrifying mechanism for charting not just physical space, but the very essence of a man's regret. And Alistair Finch, the writer with nothing left, was its latest, most meticulously surveyed specimen. Part 3, The Unwritten Future. Chapter 10, Ghosts of Characters Past. The bleed-through from Alistair's abandoned works escalated from fleeting sensory impressions to more tangible, unsettling apparitions. They weren't solid, not quite ghosts in the traditional sense, but more like emotional echoes, fragments of his imagination given hazy, temporary form, drawn from the ink of the maps and the mist of the valley. He first saw her in the dim light of late afternoon, as he stared listlessly out of the living room window. A translucent figure, a young woman in a simple, old-fashioned dress, seemed to coalesce from the swirling mist in the garden. Her features were indistinct, her form shimmering, but he recognized the posture, the way she held her head. It was Alara, the tragic heroine from The Sunken Cathedral, a sprawling historical romance he'd poured 3 years into before admitting defeat, unable to reconcile the historical accuracy he craved with the fantastical elements he'd introduced. She didn't look at him, but seemed to be searching for something amongst the overgrown rose bushes, her movements slow, sorrowful. Alistair's breath caught in his throat. He felt no fear, only a profound, aching sadness. This was a character he had loved, had lived within his mind for years, now given a spectral half-life by the cottage's strange power. As he watched, her form grew fainter, the mist swirling through her, until she dissolved back into the grey anonymity of the evening. Others followed. A grizzled, one-eyed sea captain, smelling faintly of salt and rum, Captain Thorne from The Salt-Stained Chart, would sometimes be glimpsed near the hearth, staring into the flames, his form little more than a heat-haze distortion. A nervous, bespectacled archivist, a minor character from an unfinished academic satire, would occasionally be seen _ND_heard, rustling invisible papers in the corner of Alistair's study, muttering about misplaced footnotes. These were not threats. They were manifestations of his creative detritus, the lost souls of his literary orphanage. They rarely interacted with him directly, existing in their own looped narratives, replaying fragments of scenes he had written or merely contemplated. Yet their presence was a constant, unnerving reminder of his failures, of the worlds he had failed to sustain. Sometimes, the cottage itself would briefly transform to accommodate them. For a few minutes, the scent of the sea and the creak of timbers would fill the air when Captain Thorne was present. The dusty living room might momentarily acquire the faint, musty aroma of old books and beeswax polish when the archivist appeared. These environmental shifts were subtle, disorienting, further blurring the lines of Alastair's reality. He began to feel a strange sense of responsibility towards these spectral characters. They were his creations, after all, however incomplete. He found himself speaking to them, softly, when they appeared. "I'm sorry, Elara," he whispered once, when her shimmering form drifted through the room. "I should have found a way to finish your story." The apparition, of course, gave no reply. The maps, he realized, were not just charting abstract concepts, they were dredging the depths of his subconscious, pulling forth these forgotten inhabitants of his mind. The trail of abandoned drafts, when he dared to look at it, now seemed to shimmer with faint, almost invisible figures clustered around certain points on its path, tiny echoes of the characters trapped within those unfinished narratives. The writer who believed he had nothing left was surrounded by the ghosts of everything he'd almost made. The isolation of the Umbra Valley was becoming a crowded, sorrowful place, populated by the spectral cast of his own creative impotence. Chapter 11, The Surveyor's Story. Driven by a desperate need for answers, Alastair renewed his search of the cottage, looking for anything that might explain the origin of the maps and the nature of Silas Blackwood's obsession. He avoided the attic chest itself, now too wary of its contents, but scoured every other nook and cranny. Behind a loose stone in the hearth of the main fireplace, his fingers brushed against something soft and yielding. He pulled it out. It was a small, leather-bound journal, its pages brittle and filled with the same spidery, meticulous script he recognized from the maps. It was Blackwood's diary. He sank into the dusty armchair, his heart pounding, and began to read. The early entries were mundane, observations about the weather in the Umbra Valley, notes on gardening, mentions of books read. Blackwood, it seemed, had also come to the valley seeking solitude, though his reasons were initially vague, a weariness of the world, a need for untrammeled thought. He, too, had been a man of letters, though not a novelist. Silas Blackwood had been a poet, one whose slim volumes had garnered critical acclaim but little public interest, eventually leading to a quiet, bitter retreat from the literary world. Then, the entries began to change. Blackwood described finding an old, forgotten cache of surveyor's tools in the attic, left by an even earlier, unknown occupant of the cottage. He wrote of a strange compulsion to begin mapping the valley, not just its physical features, but something more, ineffable. "The mists here," one entry read, "they are not mere water vapor. They are memory, regret, the unsaid. I feel it. I must chart it." Soon, Blackwood described the first uncanny occurrences. Discrepancies on his hand-drawn maps, lines shifting, new features appearing overnight. He wrote of his initial disbelief, his attempts to rationalize the phenomena. Then came the dawning realization, the maps were responding to his internal state, his own unspoken griefs and poetic frustrations. "The familiar of lost stanzas appeared on the chart of the lower meadow this morn," he wrote. "I had spent the night wrestling with a particularly stubborn couplet. The connection is undeniable. The valley, or some genius loci within it, translates the soul's terrain into geography." The journal detailed Blackwood's growing obsession. He began to create more allegorical maps, attempting to chart his own creative process, his despair, his fading hopes. He wrote of the bleed-through effect, of smelling the phantom roses of a love long lost, when a map depicting a garden from his youth became active. He described feeling watched, hearing whispers, the echoes of unborn verse. The later entries grew more frantic, more unhinged. Blackwood felt he was no longer in control. The maps were demanding more of him, drawing him deeper into their surreal landscapes. He wrote of trying to resist, only for the manifestations to intensify. He mentioned a great redactor, a shadowy presence he believed was the true force behind the maps, using him as a conduit. "It wants to chart everything," a near-illegible scrawl stated. "Not just my failures, but the potential of what could be, what must be. The unwritten. The unconceived." The final entry was chilling. The last map has begun to draw itself. It shows a path I do not recognize, into a place that feels final. It is not a landscape of regret, but of oblivion. Or perhaps, of terrifying genesis. I must follow. There is no other way. The ink calls to me. The redactor waits. After that, the pages were blank. Silas Blackwood had vanished, presumably following that final, self-drawing map. Had he become a victim of his own creation? A willing sacrifice? Or had he merged with the phenomenon, becoming part of the valley's strange, cartographic consciousness? Alastair closed the journal, a profound cold settling deep in his bones. He was not the first. He was treading a path already walked, a path that had seemingly led Blackwood to his doom. The surveyor had surveyed himself into oblivion, and Alastair, the failed novelist, was now the subject of the same relentless, spectral cartography. The knowledge was both terrifying and, in a strange way, clarifying. He understood, now, the nature of the force he was dealing with, or at least, Blackwood's interpretation of it. And he knew that a similar, final map, might soon begin to draw itself for him. Chapter 12, Walking the Drafts. The compulsion, intertwined with a desperate, scholarly curiosity fueled by Blackwood's journal, finally overcame Alastair's fear. He knew he couldn't simply wait for the house and its maps to dictate his fate. He had to understand the process, to experience it more directly, even if it meant surrendering to the phenomenon. He chose the trail of abandoned drafts. It felt like the most personal, the most relevant of the allegorical maps, aside from the horrifyingly accurate topography of wasted potential. He spread it out on the living room floor, the lamplight casting long, dancing shadows. He took a deep breath, the scent of old paper and faint, otherworldly ink filling his nostrils. Then, with a trembling finger, he began to trace the main path, starting from a point marked the glimmer of an idea. As his finger moved across the parchment, the familiar wave of dizziness washed over him, stronger this time. The cottage living room seemed to recede, the light dimming, the sounds of the wind outside fading into a dull roar. The texture of the map beneath his finger felt suddenly different. Not like paper, but like soft earth, then rough stone, then something else entirely. The world around him shimmered, then resolved into a new, yet hauntingly familiar landscape. He was standing on a dusty, windswept plain under a sky the color of a fading bruise. Before him, a crude, half-built tower of mismatched stones listed precariously, the unfinished citadel of King Alaric, the central setting of a heroic fantasy epic he'd abandoned a decade ago after realizing he had no idea how to resolve the central conflict. The air smelled of dust and ozone. He could hear the distant caw of unseen birds. He looked down at his hands, they were his own. He was physically present, or so it felt, within the world of his abandoned draft. He walked, hesitantly at first, then with a growing sense of dreamlike inevitability, towards the tower. As he approached, he saw figures moving within its crumbling walls, vague, shadowy forms, their features indistinct, like the characters he had never fully fleshed out. He heard snippets of dialogue, the very lines he had written and then discarded, echoing around him. The prophecy is unclear. But who can wield the crimson shard? He wasn't just observing, he was experiencing it. He felt the grit of the path beneath his boots, though he was wearing slippers in the cottage, the chill of the wind on his face. He tried to speak to one of the shadowy figures, but his voice caught in his throat, as if the rules of this phantom world forbade interaction. He was a ghost in his own ghost story. He spent what felt like hours wandering through this landscape of his own making, revisiting scenes, encountering half-formed characters, reliving the frustrations and dead ends that had led him to abandon the work. He walked through the forest of tangential subplots, its trees formed of tangled, unreadable script. He crossed the river of inconsistent timelines, its waters dark and murky. The experience was profoundly unsettling, a guided tour through his own creative necropolis. It wasn't terrifying in a visceral sense. But the psychological weight was immense, each scene a reminder of wasted effort, of stories that would never be told. When he finally stumbled upon a section of the map marked, "The author's retreat, exhaustion," the landscape around him began to waver. The dusty plain, the half-built tower, the shadowy figures, they flickered and dissolved, like mist burning off in the sun. He found himself back in the living room of the cottage, kneeling on the floor, his hands still resting on the trail of abandoned drafts. His heart was pounding, his clothes damp with a cold sweat. He had walked the draft. It had been a journey into his own mind, made terrifyingly real by the power of the maps. He now understood the immersive, dangerous potential of Blackwood's legacy. He also knew, with a chilling certainty, that this was only the beginning. The maps had more to show him, and the most frightening journeys were yet to come. Chapter 13, The Blank Page. The days following his walk through the trail of abandoned drafts were filled with a new kind of dread. Alistair felt changed, as if a layer of his own reality had been stripped away, leaving him more exposed, more vulnerable to the cottage's insidious influence. He avoided the maps, locking the chest and even pushing a heavy dresser against the attic ladder, a futile gesture of defiance. But the house, and whatever consciousness animated it, would not be denied. It began subtly. He noticed a blank sheet of high-quality parchment, similar to that used for Blackwood's maps, lying on his desk one morning. He hadn't put it there. He threw it in the fire, watching it curl and blacken with a grim satisfaction. The next day, another identical sheet was in its place. Then, the sounds of the scratching pen intensified, no longer confined to the attic but seemingly emanating from the very walls around him. He would catch fleeting glimpses of ink stains appearing on the wallpaper, only to vanish when he looked directly. The air grew thick with the phantom smell of fresh, wet ink. One evening, as a storm raged outside, the wind howling like a banshee through the Umbra Valley, Alistair sat huddled by the fire, the Blackwood journal clutched in his lap. A sudden, sharp crack echoed from the attic. He ignored it. Then another, louder this time, followed by the distinct sound of something heavy falling. With a sense of grim inevitability, he moved the dresser, his muscles straining, and ascended the ladder. The attic was cold, a damp wind whistling through a newly broken pane in the small window. The chest containing the maps lay open. And spread on the dusty floor, illuminated by the flashes of lightning outside, was a new map. Or rather, the beginning of one. It was a large sheet of the same pristine parchment he'd been finding on his desk. But this was no copy of an existing chart. Upon its surface, lines were appearing, seemingly drawing themselves in black, glistening ink. There was no hand guiding the pen, no visible mechanism. The ink simply flowed, coalescing into symbols, contours, and pathways, as if an invisible cartographer were at work. Alistair watched, mesmerized and horrified. This was what Blackwood had described in his final entry: "The last map has begun to draw itself." The emerging landscape was unlike any of the others. It was stark, minimalist, yet possessed of a terrifying grandeur. It depicted a single, narrow path winding upwards, through jagged, crystalline structures that seemed to defy gravity. There were no familiar allegorical names, no comforting, or mocking, labels. Just the stark, unyielding progression of the path into an unknown, almost alien, territory. The ink describing this new terrain seemed to absorb the light, creating an impression of immense depth and coldness. He didn't recognize this landscape. It wasn't from his past failures, nor did it seem to represent his current emotional state. It felt other. A future, perhaps. Or a gateway to something beyond his comprehension. As he watched, a single, stark title began to form at the top of the map, the calligraphy sharp and decisive: "The Obsidian Ascent." Obsidian. The word struck him like a physical blow. The Obsidian Mirror, his failed novel, the very instrument of his public disgrace. Was this map a continuation of that failure? A path leading into its very heart? Or was it, as Blackwood had hinted, a journey towards oblivion, or perhaps, of terrifying genesis? The map was not yet complete. The path stretched onwards, into a still blank expanse of parchment at the top of the sheet, as if waiting for its final destination to be revealed, or perhaps, to be determined by the one who dared to follow it. Alistair knew, with a certainty that chilled him to the core, that this map was for him. It was his final draft, his uncharted territory. The house, the mist, the legacy of Silas Blackwood, all of it had been leading to this, a blank page slowly filling with a terrifying, inescapable narrative. The writer with nothing left was being offered one last story, one he would not write with words, but with his own unwilling footsteps. Chapter 14, The Final Draft. Alistair stared at the obsidian ascent as it continued to draw itself, the ink flowing with an unnerving, silent precision. The path snaked higher, through impossible geometries of crystalline black, towards a peak that was still shrouded, undefined, on the parchment. The air in the attic grew colder, and the scent of ink was overpowering, mixed with a faint, mineral tang, like broken stone. He felt the familiar, insidious pull, stronger now than ever before, the compulsion to trace the path, to follow where it led. But this time, it was accompanied by a profound, visceral fear. The other maps, for all their psychological torment, had been rooted in his past, his known failures. This was a journey into the unknown, into something forged from the very essence of his deepest disgrace, yet leading somewhere alien, perhaps monstrous. He thought of Blackwood's final, cryptic words, "The redactor waits." Was that what lay at the summit of this obsidian ascent? The architect of this torment? Or perhaps, the source of some terrible, unholy inspiration? For days, Alistair resisted. He barricaded the attic again. He tried to focus on escape, on survival. But the map's influence permeated the cottage. The image of the obsidian ascent was seared into his mind. He saw its crystalline structures in the patterns of frost on the window panes, in the jagged shadows cast by the bare trees outside. The scratching of the invisible pen was a constant whisper in his ears. His food tasted of ash. Sleep was a landscape of black, shining peaks and treacherous, narrow paths. The spectral characters from his abandoned drafts grew more agitated, their forms less distinct, as if the new map were drawing energy from them, consuming their faint reality. Ilara's shimmering figure now looked terrified, her silent pleas more urgent. One night, he woke to find the map itself lying on the floor beside his bed. The barricade on the attic door was undisturbed. It had simply appeared. The path was almost complete now, leading to a single, stark pinnacle, wreathed in what looked like frozen lightning. He knew he couldn't fight it any longer. Either he followed, or he would be consumed by the anticipation, by the relentless pressure of its unwritten conclusion. He was a writer, and a story, however terrifying, demanded an ending. Taking a deep breath, he dressed in his warmest clothes. He found Blackwood's journal, tucking it into his pocket, a talisman against the unknown. He didn't know if this would be a physical journey or another plunge into a psychologically manifested landscape. He suspected it might be both. He spread the obsidian ascent on the living room floor. The cottage was deathly silent, the storm outside having subsided, leaving behind an eerie, mist-choked stillness. He knelt, his gaze fixed on the starting point of the path. This was it. His final draft. With a trembling hand, Alistair Finch, the writer with nothing left, placed his finger on the map. The world dissolved. Not into a dreamlike reconstruction of a past work, but into something far more visceral, more real. The floor beneath him became cold, hard, and slick, like polished obsidian. The air grew bitingly cold, carrying the sharp scent of ozone and something else, something ancient and vast. He was standing at the foot of an enormous, jagged mountain range, composed entirely of gleaming black rock, its peaks scraping a sky filled with roiling, violet clouds. This was no mere projection. He could feel the wind tear at his clothes, the solid, unforgiving rock beneath his boots. He looked back. The cottage, the Umbra Valley, were gone. There was only the terrifying, majestic desolation of the obsidian ascent. The path was clear, a narrow, treacherous track winding upwards. He began to walk. The climb was arduous, demanding all his physical and mental strength. The obsidian surfaces were slippery, the wind threatened to hurl him into bottomless crevasses. He saw no life, heard no sound but the shriek of the wind and the crunch of his own footsteps. The landscape was utterly alien, yet disturbingly familiar, echoing the cold, sharp edges of his most profound despair. As he climbed, he felt something. A presence. Not watching him, but drawing him upwards, a vast, indifferent intelligence. The redactor. He encountered strange phenomena. Walls of obsidian would shimmer, and for a moment, he would see reflected within them scenes from his life, his failures, his regrets, magnified and distorted. Critics' faces sneered from the rock, lines from his rejected manuscripts glowed like mocking epitaphs. He pressed on, driven by a grim determination, or perhaps by the map's relentless will. After what felt like days of climbing, exhausted and frostbitten, he reached a high plateau. Before him stood a colossal, throne-like structure, also carved from obsidian. And seated upon it, or perhaps part of it, was a figure. It was vast, vaguely humanoid, but its form shifted, composed of shadow and fractured light, its features impossible to discern. It seemed to radiate an intense cold, and a profound, ancient silence. This, he knew, was the source. The cartographer. The redactor. It did not speak, but understanding flooded Alastair's mind. This entity was not malevolent, not in any human sense. It was a force of raw, untamed creation and uncreation, a being that existed to chart the narratives of existence, the topographies of thought, emotion, and potential. Blackwood had been a conduit. Alastair was another. The maps were its tools, its language. It offered him a choice, not in words, but in a wave of pure comprehension that resonated deep within his being. He could turn back, attempt to find his way out of this obsidian realm, though the path was uncertain, and the maps would likely continue to haunt him, seeking new ways to chart his unraveling. Or, he could embrace the ascent. He could become part of this process. Not to be consumed, but to contribute. To lend his own narrative voice, his writer's understanding, to the endless cartography. To help chart not just regret, but also the faintest glimmer of hope, the unspoken story, the path untaken that might yet lead to something new. He looked at his hands, raw and bleeding from the climb. He thought of his failures, the silence that had consumed him. He thought of Blackwood, who had followed his own map to its conclusion, perhaps finding oblivion, perhaps finding a different kind of purpose. What was there to go back to? More silence. More regret. Alastair Finch, the writer who had believed he had nothing left, looked up at the shifting, immense figure on the obsidian throne. A new kind of understanding, a terrifying and exhilarating clarity, dawned within him. Perhaps the purpose of a writer wasn't just to create stories, but to become one, to be charted, and in being charted, to chart in return. He took a step forward, towards the throne, towards the heart of the obsidian ascent. The path ahead was unknown, terrifying, but it was no longer blank. He felt a pen, cold and smooth, materialize in his hand. Chapter 15, Coda. Mrs. Gable, the estate agent, unlocked the door to the cottage in the Umbra Valley. It had been several months since Mr. Finch had missed his rental payment, and her calls had gone unanswered. She'd assumed he'd simply left, another city dweller unable to handle the solitude. The cottage was cold, silent, and thick with dust. It felt emptier than before. She walked through the rooms, her footsteps echoing. In the living room, on the dusty floor, lay a single, antique drafting pen. Nothing else seemed out of place, just the usual signs of neglect. She made her way to the attic. The chest was there, closed. Curiosity pricked at her. She remembered Mr. Finch asking about the previous tenant, the reclusive Mr. Blackwood. She lifted the heavy lid. Inside, the collection of antique maps lay neatly rolled. But on top of them, spread flat, was a new chart. It was drawn on fresh parchment, the ink still possessing a subtle sheen, as if recently applied. The calligraphy was meticulous, elegant, yet subtly different from Blackwood's. The map depicted the Umbra Valley itself, but with an astonishing, almost preternatural detail. Every tree, every stream, every rise and fall of the land was rendered with loving precision. But intertwined with the familiar geography were new, surreal features, the glen of quiet epiphanies, the spring of second chances, the ridge of tentative beginnings. And leading away from the small icon representing the cottage, a new path was inked, faint but clear. It wound its way out of the valley, not towards any known town or landmark, but towards the distant, mist-shrouded peaks, eventually disappearing off the edge of the parchment into an uncharted expanse. At the bottom of the map, in small, neat lettering, was a single annotation: Finch, cartographer. Mrs. Gable stared at it, a shiver running down her spine. She didn't understand it. She quickly closed the chest, a sense of profound unease settling over her. Mr. Finch was gone, that much was clear. But something of him, or something new born from his presence, remained. Outside, the mist swirled through the Umbra Valley, thicker than usual. For a moment, Mrs. Gable thought she heard a faint sound carried on the wind, not a pen scratching on paper, but the distant, almost imperceptible hum of a story just beginning to be told. She shivered again, locked the cottage, and hurried away, eager to leave the shadows and the silence of the valley behind her. The maps, and their new surveyor, would remain, charting the endless, shifting landscapes of regret, and perhaps, of redemption. The salt spray kissed Clara's face, a cold, damp welcome to Seabrook. Each gust of wind seemed to whisper accusations, carrying the phantom scent of Michael's cologne, the sterile perfume of the mediator's office, the cloying sweetness of the cheap wine Daniel had favored. She hugged herself tighter, the wool of her coat a poor defense against the chill that had settled deep in her bones months ago, right around the time she'd uttered the words that had dynamited her marriage: "Michael, I had an affair." Tide's End Cottage clung to the cliff edge like a stubborn limpet, its whitewashed walls stained green by the relentless sea air. It was small, isolated enough for penitence but not so remote as to feel truly unmoored. Or so she'd hoped. The estate agent, a woman with a relentlessly cheerful smile and eyes that had clearly sized up Clara's desperation, had called it characterful. Clara called it her exile. Inside, the air was thick with the ghosts of previous lives, dried lavender, old pipe tobacco, and an overarching scent of damp wool and something else, something uniquely maritime and ancient, like the inside of a conch shell. The previous owner, a Mr. Alastair Finch, had died some months back. A recluse, the agent had chirped. Kept to himself. Simply, passed away. Natural causes, they say, though no one had seen him for a week or two. The image of an old man decaying amidst his solitude had, perversely, drawn Clara in. Misery, it seemed, loved company, even the spectral kind. Most of Finch's belongings had been cleared out, leaving behind a Spartan collection of mismatched furniture. Except for the study. Tucked away at the back of the cottage, overlooking the churning gray Atlantic, the small room was dominated by a large, scarred wooden desk and built-in shelves groaning under the weight of rolled-up charts and leather-bound logbooks. A single wooden crate sat in the corner, overflowing with more. Nautical maps, hundreds of them, it seemed. The agent had suggested they could be disposed of, but Clara, feeling a strange kinship with Finch's apparent obsession, had asked for them to be left. For the first week, Clara moved through the cottage like a wraith, her energy solely dedicated to the basics of survival and the meticulous nursing of her guilt. She'd confessed. That was the part that gnawed at her most. Not the affair itself, that was a shameful, feverish mistake, a symptom of a deeper decay, but the confession. She had wielded the truth like a weapon, shattering Michael, shattering herself. His face, when she told him, was a recurring image, more vivid than any dream, the initial confusion, the dawning horror, the utter devastation that had hollowed out his eyes. He hadn't shouted. That was worse. He'd simply looked at her as if she were a stranger, a monster he'd inexplicably harbored in his home for a decade. The divorce had been swift, brutal in its civility. She'd asked for nothing, taken only her clothes and the suffocating weight of her regret. The dreams had started then, or perhaps, had simply intensified. They were always the same. She was on a small, featureless boat, rowing through an oily, black sea under a starless sky. In the distance, a smudge of land, a tiny, hunched island, featureless save for a single, skeletal tree. She knew, with the unshakable certainty of dreams, that this was where she was meant to take her secrets, the ugly, writhing things she carried inside her. She would row and row, but the island would never get closer, a perpetually out-of-reach repository for her shame. She always woke up exhausted, the phantom ache of oars in her arms. It was on a particularly bleak Tuesday, the rain lashing against the study window like angry fists, that Clara finally unrolled one of Finch's charts. It was a detailed depiction of the local coastline, from Seabrook Point down to Blackwood Bay. The paper was thick, creamy, crackling with age. The lines were exquisitely drawn, the lettering neat and precise. She traced the familiar curve of the coast with a fingertip, the names of coves and submerged rocks like forgotten incantations. Her own cottage, Tide's End, wasn't marked, too insignificant perhaps, or built after this particular chart was rendered. She spent the afternoon exploring the crate, pulling out chart after chart. Some were vast, showing entire oceans, others focused on tiny, intricate harbors in faraway lands. The smell of old paper, ink, and a faint, metallic tang from the brass-ended rolling pins filled the small room. It was a world away from her own, a world of exploration, of fixed points and known dangers. A comfort, of sorts. One chart, larger than the others, depicted the broader region, showing the coastline where Seabrook nestled and stretching out into the open sea. She smoothed it on the desk, weighting its corners with a tarnished sextant and a heavy glass paperweight shaped like a ship's wheel, both clearly Finch's. She remembered the estate agent mentioning he'd been a keen amateur sailor in his youth. The sea beyond the coastline was a vast expanse of pale blue, meticulously marked with depths and currents. She scanned it, her gaze drifting. Nothing remarkable. Just endless, empty ocean. Over the next few days, Clara developed a routine. Morning, coffee, staring at the turbulent sea, replaying every disastrous moment of the last 6 months. Afternoon, a brisk, punishing walk along the cliff path, the wind whipping her hair and scouring her thoughts. Evening, the study, and Mr. Finch's maps. She kept returning to the large regional chart. There was something about its blankness, the sheer expanse of open water it depicted, that mirrored the void within her. She'd run her fingers over the area representing the sea off Seabrook, the place where her dream island should be. Empty. Always empty. One evening, a week after first unfurling it, she was staring at that patch of sea on the chart. A headache throbbed behind her eyes, a dull counterpoint to the sharper pain in her chest. She'd argued with her sister on the phone earlier, a brief, brittle conversation where unspoken accusations hung heavy in the air. The guilt was a physical presence tonight, a sour taste in her mouth, a cold knot in her stomach. She blinked. Was it a trick of the light, the flickering oil lamp she preferred to the harsh overhead bulb? A smudge. A tiny, almost imperceptible discoloration on the pale blue, far out to sea, roughly where her dream island always hovered. She leaned closer, her breath misting the paper. It was no bigger than her little fingernail, a faint, grayish mark, like an old water stain or a careless fingerprint. She hadn't noticed it before. Surely, she would have. She'd stared at this exact spot for hours. She touched it. The paper there felt no different. She picked up a magnifying glass from Finch's desk, its lens thick and yellowed. Underneath, the smudge remained just that, a smudge. Indistinct. Probably nothing. An imperfection in the old paper, brought to her attention by fatigue and an overactive imagination. The next day, the smudge was still there. And it was, she thought, a fraction darker. She measured its position relative to Seabrook Point with a pair of Finch's brass dividers, then frowned. It seemed, fractionally closer. No, that was impossible. She was letting her dreams bleed into reality. This cottage, this isolation, it was getting to her. But the island, for in her heart, she already knew what it was, continued its subtle assault on the map. Each day, fueled by some fresh wave of remorse or a particularly vivid memory of Daniel's touch or Michael's pained silence, it seemed to coalesce. The smudge elongated, then rounded. Faint internal lines appeared, hinting at a contour, a rise of land. It was no longer just a stain, it was an intention. Clara's dreams intensified. The island was clearer now, its desolate shore more defined. The skeletal tree seemed to beckon. She would wake with the taste of salt on her lips, the sound of waves, not the ones crashing below tide's end, but a different rhythm, a softer, more secretive lapping she associated with the dream island, echoing in her ears. One morning, after a night spent wrestling with a particularly potent memory of a lie she told Michael, a casual, devastating untruth about working late, she went straight to the study. The chart lay open on the desk. The island was no longer a smudge. It was undeniably there, a small, perfectly formed circle of land, inked in a slightly darker shade than the surrounding sea, complete with a tiny, almost microscopic mark at its center that could only be her dream's skeletal tree. And it was, unmistakably, closer to the charted coastline. Panic, cold and sharp, pierced through the fog of her guilt. She grabbed the dividers, her hand trembling. Yes. It had moved. Or rather, it had grown, as if emerging from the depths, its leading edge now significantly nearer to the depiction of Seabrook. She stumbled back from the desk, a choked cry escaping her. This wasn't grief playing tricks. This was, something else. Something impossible. She spent the rest of the day away from the study, trying to convince herself it was an elaborate self-deception. She even drove into the small town of Seabrook, buying groceries she didn't need, making stilted conversation with the shopkeeper, anything to feel grounded in reality. The town felt normal, reassuringly mundane. But the image of the island on the chart was burned into her mind. That evening, she forced herself back into the study. The chart was as she'd left it. The island was still there, a silent, inked accusation. She looked at the other charts, desperately seeking similar anomalies. On a detailed plan of Seabrook Harbor, a buoy she knew existed, marking the channel entrance, seemed fainter, its ink faded, while another, further out, one she didn't recognize, was now sharply defined. On a bathymetric chart showing seabed contours, the depths around the area where the dream island would be, if it were real, seemed to have shallowed, the lines subtly redrawn. Her gaze fell upon a small, leather-bound logbook on Finch's desk. Its pages were filled with spidery handwriting, observations of weather, tides, and bird migrations. Tucked into the back was a loose sheet of paper, a more recent entry, the ink fresher. It calls for new marks. The currents shift with the tides of memory. She surfaces again, demanding acknowledgement. The old paths are no longer true. Clara's blood ran cold. She surfaces again. Was Finch talking about a real island? Or something else? The ink was old, but not ancient. It could have been written months ago, weeks even. A floorboard creaked upstairs. Clara froze, her heart hammering. She was alone in the cottage. Had been for weeks. She strained her ears. Silence, save for the relentless moan of the wind around the eaves and the distant crash of waves. The sound of the sea. But was it only the sea? Or was there something else beneath it, a faint, rhythmic scratching, like a pen nib dragged across old paper? She looked back at the regional chart, at the island. It seemed to pulse faintly in the lamplight, its dark ink almost wet. And with a sickening lurch, she realized it wasn't just closer to the coastline on the map, it was closer to tide's end. If the map were a true representation, the island was no longer a distant dream. It was drawing nearer, emerging from the paper ocean, heading for her shore. Her hand strayed to her throat. The dream island. Her island of secrets. It was coming for her. The bleed-through began subtly. A few days after the island solidified on the chart, Clara was in the kitchen, listlessly making tea, when she smelled it, a sharp, unfamiliar brine, different from the usual scent of the Seabrook coast. It was laden with the odor of decaying kelp and something else, a faintly metallic, mineral tang. It was the smell of her dream island, vivid and unmistakable. She rushed to the window, but the sea outside was its usual gray, the air carrying only the clean, cold scent of the Atlantic. The smell faded as quickly as it came, leaving her trembling, the teacup rattling in its saucer. The sound started next. Not just the creaks and groans of an old cottage settling, or the scratching she sometimes thought she heard from the study. These were different. One afternoon, while reading in the living room, trying to distract herself with a novel, she heard it, the distant, mournful clang of a buoy bell. Seabrook Harbor had bells, but this was a different tone, deeper, more resonant, matching the phantom sound that sometimes echoed in her dreams. She held her breath, listening. It came again, 3 mournful tolls, then silence. And then, objects. Small, insignificant things. A piece of driftwood, silvered and smooth, unlike any she'd seen on the local beach, appeared on the mantelpiece. She knew she hadn't put it there. It was shaped like a bird in flight, elegant and strange. When she reached for it, it felt unnaturally cold, and as her fingers brushed it, it dissolved into a shimmer of dust that vanished before it hit the hearth. Later, a single, black feather, impossibly large, lay on the doorstep. She'd seen no such bird nearby. It, too, crumbled to nothing when touched. These were the detritus of her dream island, flotsam from a place that shouldn't exist. The previous owner, Mr. Finch, began to feel less like a distant anecdote and more like a presence. The study, where the maps held court, became the focal point of this unease. Clara found herself increasingly reluctant to enter. When she did, the air was always colder, the silence more profound, yet charged. She'd feel a prickling on her neck, the unmistakable sensation of being watched. Sometimes, his antique surveying tools, a set of parallel rulers, a pair of tarnished dividers, a heavy brass compass, would be subtly repositioned on the desk. She'd leave the dividers closed, only to find them splayed open hours later, their points aimed towards the island on the regional chart. The inkwells, long dried, sometimes seemed to glisten faintly. One evening, driven by a desperate need to understand, she forced herself to spend hours in the study, poring over Finch's logbooks. His entries became more erratic in the final years. He wrote less about the weather and more about the submerged topography of sorrow and the cartography of unatoned acts. One entry chilled her to the core: the island demands its tribute. Each regret a fathom deeper, each secret a new shoal. I chart its approach, but I fear I am charting my own damnation. Was this Finch's madness, or had he too seen an island grow on his maps, an island born of his own hidden grief? The circumstances of his death, natural causes, but found alone after days, suddenly seemed more sinister. Had he been consumed by his charts, by his island? The maps themselves seemed to exert a pull. Clara felt a growing, unnerving compulsion to interact with them beyond mere observation. An urge to correct them, as if the changes were errors she needed to fix, to erase the encroaching island. Yet, simultaneously, a darker curiosity bloomed: what if she followed it? What if she charted a course from tide's end to its shores? The thought was both terrifying and strangely seductive. When she tried to resist the study, to ignore the charts, the phenomena intensified. One morning, after a particularly restless night avoiding the room, she found the regional chart unrolled on the kitchen table. The island was visibly larger, its edge now alarmingly close to the mapped coastline. A new, faint line, like a current, seemed to be drawing itself from the island directly towards the point on the coast where tide's end would be. The most disturbing development came a few days later. She'd been tidying the bedroom, trying to impose some order on the chaos of her emotions, when she noticed another chart, one she hadn't paid much attention to, a rudimentary floor plan of the cottage itself, likely sketched by Finch for some long-forgotten renovation. It was crude, but accurate. As she looked, a small, red ink X appeared on the map, marking the very spot she was standing in. She gasped, dropping a pile of clothes. Her heart hammered. She moved to the window, and on the map, the red X crawled across the paper, mirroring her movement. It was tracking her. Later that day, she misplaced her keys. After a frantic search, she remembered the cottage plan. With trepidation, she looked at it. A tiny circle, drawn in the same red ink, now marked a spot on the kitchen counter. Her keys were there, half hidden under a newspaper. The map wasn't just tracking her, it was reflecting her immediate reality, her mundane anxieties. The island chart, however, remained the true tormentor. It began to acquire a new, terrifying layer of detail. It was no longer just a physical landmass. Faint, spidery lines, like contour lines, spread across its surface, but they were annotated with words in a script that looked like Finch's, yet also disturbingly like her own: the shoals of deceit, the bay of bitter words, the silent peak of guilt. It was becoming a topography of her regret, her affair laid bare in cartographic form. The central skeletal tree was now labeled, Heart's Betrayal. The bleed-through effect escalated. The scent of the dream island, that specific brine and decaying kelp, now clung permanently to the study, sometimes seeping into other rooms. The temperature in the study would plummet unexpectedly, the air growing heavy and damp, as if a sea fog had rolled in, though the windows remained clear. One evening, staring at the regional chart, mesmerized by the island's relentless approach, the room around her shifted. The scent of the island intensified, and the light from her lamp seemed to dim, replaced by a pearlescent, gray luminescence. The walls of the study flickered, and for a terrifying moment, she saw not the cluttered room, but a desolate, shingle beach, the waves of a black sea lapping at its edge. She could hear the cries of unfamiliar seabirds and feel a damp, chilling wind. It was the shore of the dream island. She cried out, stumbling backward, and the vision snapped, the study reasserting itself, though she was left shaking, the phantom chill clinging to her skin. She was losing her grip. Was this real? Was she going mad? The line between her inner turmoil and the external world was dissolving. Michael's face, etched with pain, would flash before her eyes when she looked at a certain coordinate on the island map. The hushed, illicit whispers she'd shared with Daniel seemed to echo from the faded ink depicting the shoals of deceit. Mr. Finch's presence became more overt. She never saw him clearly, but there were glimpses, a faded, stooped silhouette reflected in the glass of a framed chart when she turned too quickly, the distinct impression of cold, papery fingers brushing her arm as she reached for a map. His work, it seemed, continued. New annotations would appear on charts she hadn't touched for days, tidal predictions updated in his spidery hand, faint pencil lines sketching new, impossible coastlines on blank expanses of sea. One afternoon, she found a new piece of paper on Finch's desk, weighted down by the brass compass. It was a fresh sheet, yet the ink was styled like his. On it, a single, chilling sentence: the cartographer does not merely record the world, but calls it forth. Beware the territories you chart within yourself, for they long for dominion. The island on the main chart was now terrifyingly close to the coastline, its leading edge almost touching the depiction of Seabrook Point. The faint current line leading to Tide's End was darker, more insistent. Clara felt a profound dread. The map was no longer a passive object, it was an active threat, drawing its terrible geography closer and closer to her reality. Her secrets, her guilt, her betrayal, they were not just being mapped, they were being summoned. And the island, the physical embodiment of it all, was almost at her door. She felt trapped, charted, her escape to Tide's End having become the very epicenter of her haunting. The question was no longer if the island would arrive, but what would happen when it did.